We'll be getting started in around 4 minutes, so feel free to get yourself ready. And like I said before, if you have not forked the repo yet, forked and cloned the Git repo before we start, please do so. Please make sure that you do fork it because it is really important that we keep it as a skeleton and not populated with the contents of today's workshop. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to our first event of the semester, UTS Tech Society's Intro to Full Stack Development Workshop. Firstly, on behalf of the UTS Tech Society, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. And we would also like to pay our respects to elders past, present, and future, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of this land. My name is Rachel, and I'm joined by Hasith, who will be teaching you during the workshop. And yeah, on to you, Hasith.
Yep, so first off, we have some housekeeping rules. That it just helps us run the event smoothly. So first, please keep your webcams and mics off. We really appreciate it if we could get through this workshop. It will be recorded, so if you do have to look back on anything, it is there. The recording is available. Don't hack our database. Our password will be on display. And please just keep it all right and I guess enjoyable for everyone.
It'll be blurred out in the recording.
Yeah. And yeah, if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them. Just type them into the chat, and because we'll be alternating, when I'm presenting, Rachel will look at the questions, and when I'm presenting, when Rachel's presenting, I'll be looking at the questions. So yeah, so let's just have a quick overview as to what we're covering today. The first thing we're going to start off is answering the question, what is full stack development? And then we'll be looking at the MERN stack, the stack that we'll be using today. And we'll also be looking at the project that we'll be doing and a little bit of a demo. Then we will be building the backend, and that'll be me building the backend. And then I'll hand it over to Rachel, who will build the front end. And unfortunately, we'll not be hosting the application, but there is some extra steps there that you guys can take with yourself after this workshop, so you can continue on after this workshop concludes. Over to you, Rachel.
Yeah. So yeah, what is full stack development? It's a term that's commonly thrown around in a lot of developer jobs. So it's full stack development is basically a combination of technologies that make up an application. From the front end, which is what the screen as the user see it, and it's how you interact with the data, to the back end, which consists of the server-side logic, interacts with the data, and serves the data to the front end so the user can interact with it in the first place. And also vice versa, saving the changes that the user makes.
Cool. So what is the MERN stack? So like we said, it consists of both front end and back end technologies, a full stack application. So MERN represents different things in our tech stack. So MongoDB, that's our database. And it's an interesting sort of database technology because it's document oriented, unlike most relational databases. So that's what we're going to be using as our database. We're also going to be using Express, which is a web framework. We're mainly going to be using it for routing, and it also has a lot of abstractions that help us with coding this application. We'll also be using React, which is our JavaScript library for building UIs. Fun fact, maintained by Facebook and created by an employee of Facebook. So it is in demand and it's everywhere nowadays. And finally, NodeJS, which is a JavaScript backend runtime environment, essentially allowing us to run JavaScript outside of a browser. Over to you, Rachel.
Alrighty, so I will share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
I will share the app that we're going to be making today. So if you all can see, it's a fortune cookie generator. So yeah, so we have a fortune cookie generator. We can open a cookie and get a fortune. We can reset it to close the cookie and like have another one if we want to. We can also show the fortunes that are in the database. So we have a list here. We have the ability to edit them. So if I go edit fortune, it'll edit. If I add a fortune and click add fortune, it'll add it to the list. And of course, you can also delete it as well. So yeah, so the full kind of CRUD functionality, create, read, update, and delete, we'll be covering that today. So yeah, all the some of the parts already been set up since, if you've forked the repo at least, some of the parts of the project have already been set up, because if we started the whole project from scratch, it would take a lot longer than we have today. But don't worry, we'll be explaining everything you need to know. And if at any point you have a question, just type your question into the chat and either Hasith or I will answer it for you. I'll ask the question for you as we go. And without further ado, Hasith.
Cool. Thank you, Rachel, for that demo of the application. And we hope it provides you with some foundational knowledge. And over the course of this workshop, we'll be teaching you how to build this demo. So let's get right into it, and time to work on the back end. So let's get started with the first thing that we're going to tackle when working on the back end, which is the layout of our application. Now, this is really important. With our layout of our application, it really dictates how the whole thing is going to operate. So I've decided to break it down into 4 main components. The first component is the server. So the server starts and hosts the application. The next component is the router, which defines all the routes and the different URLs for the application. The next thing is the controller, which is what we use to essentially manipulate data on the database. It can define actions. It might be updating something. It might be deleting something. It might even be just adding new data or even removing data from the database. So that's the responsibility of the controller. We also have the model, and the model essentially, you can think of it as a blueprint of sorts. It defines the structure of objects in the application or database. And in our case, we only have one object, which is our fortune cookies. And essentially, we represent that fortune cookie with a model. So the next thing we'll move on to is talking about a bit more about our backend technology, our database, which is MongoDB. So like I said, it's going to act as the database for our backend, storing all the data, and we can retrieve data from it as well. It is a document-oriented database. So for those of you who have studied a bit of databases or might not know much about databases at all, essentially most databases are relational databases, which essentially means they are a bunch of tables with unique relationships to one another. For example, you might have a table of people, storing many information about many people, and you might have a table of vehicles. And a relationship between the two might be which person owns which vehicle. And that's a traditional relational database. However, unlike a relational database, a document-oriented database stores all this information of a given object in a single instance or a single object. So essentially what that means is, for example, if we had our person, all the information required for our person would be in that single document. The thing is with that is that it's really great for our application because we only have one object, which is our fortune, and it only has a limited amount of information required within it. So it is really quick to set up. So I'm going to hop over to MongoDB. So I hope you guys have created an account. So we're going to hop over to MongoDB and log into the website. And once you do log into the website, you'll get this sort of home screen of sorts. If you don't have this home screen, it means that you still need to create a project. So just click and create a new project, and it's relatively straightforward, and you'll come to this homepage. So the first step that we're going to do is essentially we're going to first build this database. So it's just simple as clicking build a database. And once you click it, you'll get 3 options: serverless, dedicated, and shared. Really, just for the sake of this, we're going to go with shared because it's free. That's one thing. But also it's in general all we need for our application in terms of capacity and scope. When you do more powerful full stack applications, you might need the other 2. But for now, we're just going to go with the shared tier. As you can see, it's going to create a shared cluster. And what you can consider a cluster is essentially it's a instance where our database is going to be hosted. So yep, we selected the free shared platform, and we're going to stick with AWS for this. You can choose any of them, but we'll stick with AWS for this because in terms of simplicity, and it's a default option. And we're also going to click Australia, Sydney, because we want to be as regionally close to our location as possible. But for those of you who are joining from overseas, feel free to choose the city or region that is closest to you. For us, it's going to be Sydney. So here you have cluster tiers. So essentially you'll have different levels of tiers. depending on what sort of level of power or processing power that you want for your application. We're going to go with, we're sticking with the free one here, which is the bare minimums, but it's enough for our application. We don't need to worry about additional settings because we're not backing up anything, and we're fine with the MongoDB version for now. And the cluster name can be whatever you like, but we're just going to call it fortunes for the sake of our application because it's easy to remember. So once you're done, click create cluster in the bottom, and it's going to take you back to the home page. As you can see, it says we are deploying your servers 0 out of 3 complete. Now this is going to take a while, so we're going to leave this here running, and we're going to come right back to it. So let's hop over back to the slides and see what we can do next. So the first thing that I want to cover is essentially going backwards in order of that layout of our application. So as you may saw, it goes from server to router to controller to model. We're going to go backwards. We're going to start off with the model because it is essentially the foundation of our application. So essentially what we have here is the very first line right here is we're doing constant mongoose equals require mongoose. You're probably wondering what that line does. Now, essentially in JavaScript, it's like any other programming language. We can import libraries that can be used. Similar in C# and Java, you might do the keyword abusing. For those of you who've coded in Python, it's pretty much import and from. And for those of you who code in C and C++, it is the hashtag include keyword. So in JavaScript, it's as simple as doing require, but we're going to get into more detail on that later. So we're importing the Mongoose library, and we're gaining access to the schema prototype. And now this schema prototype, you're probably wondering, okay, that's a big deal. Well, what is that? Essentially, what you can imagine is we're essentially taking this blueprint for schemas so we can create our own schema. And what is a schema? Well, a schema is a blueprint of an object. So in the case of a person, the schema might define different attributes of a person, their height, their age, their gender, and many other pieces of information. So essentially what we can consider here is that we're getting a schema and we're going to create a new schema for our object. So what's our object in the case of our application? In the case of our application, it's a fortune and the fortune cookies. So what we're going to do is right here, we create a fortune schema, and essentially we create a new schema. And essentially we define what the attributes are. Like I mentioned before, that can be, for example, with a person, their age, their height, their gender, different things. So we only have one real parameter for our, one real attribute for our fortune cookie, which is the name of the fortune, what's actually in writing on the fortune. Some of you might be wondering, wait a minute, how about IDs? Why don't we have an ID, something that we can identify a fortune with? Well, the good thing about MongoDB is that it automatically generates IDs on the actual database itself. And when it comes to Mongoose, it already knows that. So we only really have to define everything other than the ID. So as you can see down here, we define the type of the attribute, which is essentially what sort of variable type it is. It can be an integer, it can be a string, Boolean, you name it. In the case of fortune name, it is a string because it can be anything. It can be alphanumeric, which means any numbers or letters or a small amount of symbols. And essentially it can be of any length. A fixed length to a certain limit. And the next attribute we also add to this, the next parameter that we add to this attribute is required, because we do want this to be a required field. It is mandatory to fill out. Because imagine if someone opened a fortune cookie and they just got a blank piece of paper. Like, what's the point of opening the fortune cookie then? I mean, you can eat the fortune cookie, but I mean, you want the fortune. So yeah, the next line you can see here is essentially we're using Mongoose's model and schema to mimic the fortunes in our database. So essentially what we're saying here is, hey, we want to create a model from this schema, and we're going to call this model fortune. And we save that fortune model to a variable so we can export it. And what does exporting do? You're probably wondering. Well, exporting essentially allows us to access this model anywhere that we need it. by accessing the path, similarly how we would import stuff. So let's hop over to VS Code where we can actually type this out. So let me pull up VS Code right here. Oh, I've got them both open, got it open on the wrong screen, sorry about that. So as you can see, we do have our application right here. And yeah, as you can see, we do have our different layers of the application already here. As you can see, we do have the controllers, we do have the models, the routes, and our index.js, which acts as our server. So what are we working on right now? We're working on the model. So let's hop into the models folder and open fortune.model. As you can see, we already have the exports for just the fortune. Some of you might notice that yours is already complete. I recommend that you just run a git pull in the bottom, essentially just by typing git pull. There was an error over the earlier in the week where we accidentally published the completed code. So some of you might have accidentally downloaded that. Simple as calling a git pull because we've made those changes. So it's just a skeleton now. I'm not going to type it in because we already just had the skeleton, but let's continue from there. So like we said, the very first thing that we do is we import Mongoose, which essentially is allows us to interact with our MongoDB database. So we just simply go import Mongoose. That's how it looks. And simple as that, we've already imported Mongoose into our file, and we can access it using the Mongoose variable. The next thing that we want to do is we want to sort of work with the schema. So we're going to go into the Mongoose library, and we're going to access the schema. And essentially, the schema is almost like a prototype. It allows us to build things, a blueprint, which allows us to build new schemas. So essentially what we're going to do now is we're going to create our fortune schema. So essentially simple as typing fortune schema equals new schema. And then as you can see here, we're essentially going to pass in the attributes for what are attributes for our fortunes. Sorry. And as you can see, we just have one, which is fortune name because ID is already generated on the database. So that's as simple as adding that there. Sorry, I moved my cursor so you can see the code. And we define two things. We define the type of that attribute, which is a string. And like we said before, required, which is true. And we say that. There is one other thing that wasn't included there, and we want to add it just because of precautionary method. When we work with MongoDB a bit later in the backend section, we also want to make sure that we can directly access it properly. So we're going to add one thing, which is defining what collection this model belongs to. And you're probably wondering, what do you mean collection? Now, this is just as simple as doing fortunes. Also, sorry, get rid of that. And let's see what's happening here. Oh, whoops, I'm forgetting that. So this is meant to go outside. There you go. That should be all good, hopefully. I hope so.
Hey, Hasith.
Yes.
We have someone saying that we were going too fast.
Oh, I am going too fast. I'm so sorry.
Repeat the last part about collections.
Yeah, sure thing. So just going over collection one more time. Essentially, with a document-oriented database like MongoDB, essentially we define collections to store various documents of the same type. So essentially, one of our collections will be fortunes, which is what we're saying here. We're essentially saying each fortune will be stored in the fortunes collection. And this is essentially what we're defining here by adding this extra little bit here. Cool. Yeah, so the next thing that we want to do is we want to create a model from the schema, like we mentioned before, which is we just go fortune equals mongoose.model. And like I said before, we just tell that this fortune model is going to be called fortune. That's literally the first thing that we pass in as a argument. And the second thing we pass in is the schema itself. So we can link those two and we can access it anytime. Now, the good thing about doing models in regards to fortune and exporting it is that we can do operations on the fortune later on down the line. And this becomes really useful in terms of updating things, finding fortunes, creating new fortunes, and even deleting fortunes. So that's why this part is really important and why Mongoose is a literal time saver. Cool. So that's pretty much it for our fortune model. So let's hop over to the next bit, the next section, which essentially is going to cover promises. Now, this is really important in terms of understanding JavaScript in general. JavaScript has these things called asynchronous functions. I like to think of them as simultaneous functions. I'm sorry, I can't spell there. But essentially what these simultaneous functions do is it allows us to run functions parallel with one another. Imagine you have a function that downloads something, and you have some code before that function and some code after that function. Essentially, what would happen is the code before that function would run, and then the function that's downloading something would run, and you'd have to wait until that function finished downloading something before the rest of the program could continue. But with asynchronous functions, the other function, that downloading function, can be run on another thread of the machine, and the code can continue as if, yep, the function's already done, but essentially it can keep running in the background. So that's essentially what an asynchronous function is. It allows us to run functions in parallel, and it becomes really useful when fetching things from the internet. Because imagine if we had to wait for everything to download, for example, with Netflix or something, waiting for everything to load onto our page before we could actually select something. That's why you often see you can navigate on a page and things are still loading in. So I've just defined an example asynchronous function here. And I've called it async function just so we can understand it a bit. So something to note is that an asynchronous function always has two keywords. It has async, and it always has an await. And this is where promises come into play. An asynchronous function will always return a promise. And you're probably wondering, okay, what is a promise? So imagine a function exists. The function has some purpose of sorts. Essentially, the function promises that it's going to do something. It will either succeed, or the function will succeed, or the function will fail. And that's the promise. So essentially, a promise can have three different states. At the beginning of the function, the promise is pending. And we wait for this function to do something. And we have two other states, which is success, hooray, it's done, the function worked, or failure, which means the function has failed. And we use two different methods for an asynchronous function to find these promises, which is then and catch. You can have as many catches and thens as you want, but for this example and for the examples that we're going to go ahead with, it's just two. So as you can see, we essentially have then. So once this function is done and is successfully completed, we have this then value, which we get this value from this function we wait for. Essentially, we can do some things with that function, we can manipulate it, we can do whatever, and we can send back the altered value of that function. But essentially, this whole branch of code right here means the promise is fulfilled. The second part is the rejection, which is the function has failed. And we actually catch the error or the exception from that function. And that's essentially what we have here, just saying that's the error from the function we wait for. And we return the error, and essentially the promise is rejected. So it's really important to remember that the promises can have three states throughout this whole thing. They can be pending, and they can be fulfilled or rejected. And this becomes really useful when we're trying to request things from the database, because either we can fail, we can succeed, or it's mainly one of the two. Cool. So let's go into an example to see how our code that we're going to type out sort of compares to this example that I've typed out. So this is essentially what we're going to be coding. Essentially, it's a function that gets all the fortunes from the database. So you're probably thinking it's quite a bit different. There's not that much similarity between the two. And I'd say you're quite right. But there are a few key things that I want to point out. The first thing is asynchronous. Now, asynchronous is matching up. And with any asynchronous, there's always an await. And as you can see, we also have an await there. Essentially, the function that we wait for is the fortune, which is the model that we had before. And like I said, we can apply operations onto this model, which is the fortune.find function. And we wait for that to complete. Then we have two possible scenarios: the successful one, which is handled by then, and the failure, which is handled by the catch. And as you can see, there is a bit where we send some fortunes using some mechanism, or we send an error saying, oh no, you're not so fortunate. And we do this by utilizing requests and responses, as you can see with rec and res. And if you've done a little bit of web systems or any other web development subjects, or even tinkered with some web development yourself, you know that with HTTP, the hypertext transfer protocol, essentially there are requests and responses. And with the requests, essentially what we can do is, essentially a request is to a destination, and we're usually requiring something from that destination that we're sending that request to. And a response is usually from that destination back to us. It's telling us something back. So as you can see with this data, with this find function, it's obviously we're requesting to find all the fortunes, get all the fortunes, and it's going to respond with some back. So res.status, and every HTTP request and response has a, every HTTP response has a status. So it's important that we include the status there. A common HTTP response status that you might have heard of is HTTP 404 not found. And that essentially means that the path that you've tried to navigate to, there is no resource at the end of that path, and that resource is not found. So in the case of this, the status 200 essentially means status okay, and that's essentially what it means. And with that response, we send fortunes back, and we send all the fortunes that we found on the database. But what happens if there's an error? Well, we catch that error. You can put a variable in there. You don't have to. It's up to you whether you want to send that variable to the user or write a custom one. And as you can see, we wrote a custom sort of error here. The response will send a status of 400, and we will embed the error in the JSON. Essentially what happens is essentially the user will get a screen saying, yeah, that wasn't successful. You probably need to try this method again. And this is really good in terms of allowing the front end and back end developers to make sense of what each other's doing. And it's really important that you write really clear and concise error messages. For example, this is not the best error message. So it is better if we wrote something a bit better with by actually using the error that we passed. So let's get to coding this, and we're going to type this from scratch, and then we're going to mimic the design across the various other functions. So we'll just hop on over to our skeleton here. And this time we're working on the controllers, because this is a part of the controllers application. So these are the operations that we complete on the, oops, sorry, there's a pop-up there. These are the operations that we complete on the data. So as you can see, we already have 5 functions there: get all, get random fortune, create a new fortune, update an existing fortune, and delete an existing fortune. So what we're going to do is we're going to type the get all fortunes section. So let's start off with that. And it's pretty straightforward. Like we said before, every asynchronous function begins, or well, has an await in it. And essentially what we're going to do is we first need to also make sure that we import the fortune model, which is essentially what we're going to do here. So require. And as you can see, we're in the controllers folder. So we need to provide a relative path, which essentially means, okay, given a string, we are going to provide the models. And then we're going to go into the fortune model. And as you can see here, we've just essentially imported the fortune directly from that exported fortune model. Cool. So like we do that, we just do await, and we're trying to get all the fortunes. So we want to find all the fortunes. And the cool thing about Mongoose is that we have these inbuilt functions that allow us to do these things. And there's already a find there's already a find method on the model, which allows us to find all the documents of that type, of that model. So we'll get all the fortunes from this. Essentially, like I mentioned before, there will be a then clause to this, which essentially represents a success. So, sorry, let me type that up again. It'd be better if I type it up here. Yeah. And with the then, it's a success. So we're assuming that the fortunes have been returned by this find. So we can actually put those fortunes in here, and we can do some data manipulation on it. We're not going to, but this is the opportunity where you will have the chance to do those data manipulations if you're using then and await. So you can pass these values through the functions. So we get the response, like we said, because we want to send this back to the user, or Rachel in this case. So we get the response. We set the status to be 200. That's all good. And we send back the fortunes. Essentially, what this allows us to do is essentially we've set up the whole application to essentially we've set up the whole get all fortunes to retrieve all the fortunes and then allow us to do some data manipulation on it of sorts. We haven't, but then we can send it off in the response. The next thing that we can do is the catch. And you're probably wondering, okay, what do we use the catch for? And like we said before, we catch with the error. And we're going to actually we're going to get that error. Let's just click save real quick. Sorry. And we're going to immediately put in response.status. Set that to be 400. Oops, sorry. And we're going to put some JSON in here, which essentially gives us a nice format that can be presented to the user, or in this case, Rachel, if there is any issues with contacting the backend. And we're going to provide the error, and we're going to say that failed to retrieve data from the database. And as you can see, that is a lot better than saying, oh no, you're not so fortunate. And it will help in terms of diagnosing any issues. So Rachel knows that the fortunes could not be retrieved from the database. Cool. So that was the get all fortunes. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, this must be relatively similar to the other functions. And you're 100% right. The get random fortunes essentially is pretty much the same thing, except instead of getting all the fortunes, we just want to select a random one. So what we can do is we can literally copy this code. We can just
before you do that, we have a question. Why is the success call not sending JSON too?
That is a really great question. If I remember correctly, because we have the fortunes are already, I think from find, it's already in the format of the JSON, so we can just send it. I will have to double check on that, but I'm pretty sure that's why we just send it, because we can immediately store it and we can manipulate it as such. Cool. Yep, I'll continue on from there. So like I said, yeah, we can copy this await section, and we can go right into the get random fortune. And there are only a few things that we really need to change here, because the error can remain the same. We can change it a bit. Failed to retrieve random fortune. We can make that little tiny change there, so that's a bit clearer as to what happened. And yeah, but we don't want to send all the fortunes. We just want to send a random one. So we're going to be doing a bit of JavaScript magic to get a random fortune from this fortunes collection. So let's just, let's get all these fortunes, shall we? So what we can do is we can set it to a constant variable. So the thing to remember about JavaScript, you can have constant variables or you can have temporary variables, which is denoted by const or let. And let just essentially means you can reassign their values, but constant means their value does not change. So what we can do here is we can set this to be random fortune. We can set that to be equal to fortunes. And we want to access a random index in this array. And we're going to use the math library, math.for. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to I'll type it out actually. I think it'd be better if I type it out and then I explain what happens here. So cool. So essentially what happens here is we're essentially getting a random integer, a random number between 0 and 1 from the math library. And we're multiplying that by the length of the fortunes that we have, the number of fortunes that we have. And then essentially we use the floor, the math floor function to round that number down. And essentially, if you had a number like 6.7, you get a floor down to just 6. And this essentially allows us to make sure that we're getting an integer so we can access the fortune directly instead of a Boolean, which doesn't really function as an index. And so yeah, this allows us to just pick a random fortune, and that's using the math library. So yeah, now we've got a random fortune saved into a variable, and all we need to do is really send that one off. Yeah, and that's pretty much the get random fortune. As you can see, it was very similar. It was just one little difference. And that's really what we do with the get random fortune option. The next one that we have here is the create new fortune. Now this one's going to be a bit different. So I'm going to actually not copy any code for this one because we're going to have to probably go through this step by step. Because as you can imagine, there is data being sent from the front end to the destination. We're not sending any empty data to the database. We're actually sending proper data. So we need to consider the request now, the REQ rec part of the function. So with the request, essentially what happens is the request has a body, and within that body it has our actual payload, which is our fortune that is being sent from the front end. And Rachel will do all that preparation, but essentially that's something we can assume for now. So instead of constant, we're going to do let, because this is something that we are going to be doing. We may do a bit of manipulation with down the line. So we essentially say let new fortune equal to a new fortune. And we can do this because we imported the model for fortune. So we can essentially create a new fortune like this. And we say with the rec body. And that's pretty much it in terms of creating a local copy of this new fortune. So we've got a fortune locally, but we need to save it to the database. So the cool thing about saving it as a fortune locally is that we still have access to those MongoDB mongoose functions. And one of those functions is actually the save function, which allows us to directly save an object or a document to the database. Two things actually get returned. Two things can be passed as parameters, potentially an error or even or the successfully created new fortune. So as you can see here, we have error and fortune. We're going to do an arrow function. We're going to pass this into its own function here. And we're going to do something a bit different. We're not going to do a catch or anything. We are, however, going to do a if statement. And we're going to say that if there is an error, we are going to return the error. And this is something that we can copy a bit over, which is essentially this section right here, because we can just return this error because if there is an error, we just want to inform the front end, which is essentially allows us the user to be like, okay, I know that this new fortune was not created. So we can copy this section from above, and we can essentially just return that. And of course, we can alter it a bit to make it a bit more clearer. So failed to create new fortune in the database for whatever reason. And yeah, that's essentially the error part of it. And like I said before, this section now represents the promise being rejected. There is an error. The next part of this is essentially if this error did not occur, what would happen? And it's pretty simple because we do have a new fortune created and that gets stored into this fortune variable. That is as simple as just going response.json and providing that as the fortune. And that gets saved, that gets sent back in the response. Now, the reason why we do it a bit different here instead of just doing, .send is because it's the way that it's the way that the save function actually returns the data itself. So we could put it into the JSON file. Sorry, the JSON of the response. Cool. Sorry for going on and on, but we're going to move on to the next function, which is the update existing fortune function. And now this one, once again, is quite similar to the other ones. So we can head back up, not to the create new fortune, but to this section, and we can essentially just copy that the body of this function and come down here and paste it and make the alterations where we need to. So update is an interesting one because we are sending new data to the server, but it's for something that already exists. So as you can imagine, that'd be really complicated, sending that new data, finding something that matches, making that change, and then getting the updated one back. But the great thing about Mongoose is, like before, there's already something that exists. And I will type that out. And that is as simple as just doing, instead of .find, it's find one and update. Find one and update is literally everything that I just said happens within this function. It will find it. It will find a matching fortune, and it will update it with the data that we provided. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to provide this new data that we want to send in. So this is what we're going to say. We are providing the fortune ID because this is essentially what we're going to be updating. And we're essentially telling, hey, look for a ID that matches the ID that we send in the request. The next section is that we do send is the body, the request body, which is, okay, this is what we actually want to change with this. So there's two things we're sending, the ID of what we're changing and what about that object we actually want to change. And the final one is probably the most important section, which is providing a sort of parameter to this operation. And that parameter is the new parameter. And we're essentially saying that we want new to be true. Oops, sorry, new to be true. Now what new as true is, essentially it will not, I'll take a breath. This function will return the updated fortune. If we set new to be false, it would return the fortune before it was updated. So it would make that update, but it would be like, hey, this is what it used to be. But by having new as true, it essentially returns the, hey, this is the updated fortune. This is the latest state that it's in. And yeah, that's essentially what we do for the find and update. And as you can see, we do have then, and because we do get an updated fortune, what we can do, we can just rename that fortune because we're only really dealing with one. We can get rid of this random calculation because we don't need to calculate a random fortune. And what we can send in the response is just fortune. And that will send the newly updated fortune back to the front end so Rachel can display it. Finally, once again, another error. So what we can do is we can just rename it and keep it simple. So for this one, it's failed to update existing fortune. Failed to update existing fortune from the database. Yep. And finally, last but not least, delete. And delete is probably the shortest one. So I'll type this one out manually for everyone. So let's get right to it. So as we are familiar with now, we always have an await with an asynchronous function. And lucky for us, there already is a delete method that exists. So what we can do is delete one. And essentially like before, we need to tell which fortune we're deleting, and that gets sent with the request. And Rachel will do her front end magic to get that data being passed through so that we do know that which fortune we are deleting. Yeah, and this will essentially delete one of the fortunes with the matching ID. And because this ID is auto-generated, we can automatically assume that there's only going to be one match, which is why we use delete one. We all obviously have, admin. And for the, I did not type that properly. I was wondering why that happened. And for this one, we don't really need to pass any attributes because we're just deleting something. We're not expecting anything back. But what we can do is we can send back in the JSON, we can send back a message that just essentially says, successfully deleted fortune database. And of course, we will have a catch just in case this promise fails. Essentially what this will have is an error. And what we can do with this error is we can essentially just copy what we have that's already here. Let me grab that real quick. Cool. Cool. So as you can see, we have our delete existing fortune function. Essentially, it finds the matching fortune by its ID, deletes it, sends a response saying, yeah, that's all good. Or if there was any failure, hey, failed to delete. Oops, sorry, delete existing fortune from the database. Now, that was the controller side of things. It does get a lot simpler. This is probably the bulkiest file in the whole backend. So we're going to just quickly move on to the next section, which is the routing. Now, I'll quickly go over routing. And routing allows us to define URL parts and HTTP request types to these parts. So if you've ever gone on a website, you might know that if you go to, for example, abc.net.au, if you put, that will take you to the ABC homepage. But if you were to put a /news at the end of it, it'd take you to the news homepage. And essentially that's a route. That /news route or endpoint essentially directs you and provides you with a whole new amount of information, a completely different web page. So this is what routing is. It essentially defines different pathways, so to speak, that we can have in our website or our web application. So up here, we do use Express, which is something in our main stack, which is the E in our main stack. And we use the router function to create a router that we can use throughout our application. And that's what we do here. We also get the methods that we have from the Fortune controllers that we just coded. So we can provide operations that can happen at certain points in time. So just to explain what I said, for example, using the router, when a GET request is sent to the /all endpoint or route, we will call this function, get all fortunes. So if you were to go into Chrome, once we finish this and type in, if you're just running the backend and went to localhost and /all at the end of it, you would get all the fortunes from the database. And finally, we export the models, we export the router so we can use it elsewhere. And like I said, /all means the website URL, the base URL, /all. So it is an endpoint, it is the last section of the URL. And like I said, by exporting the router, we can use it in another file. So let's get right to it. This is relatively straightforward in comparison to the controller. So let's get that open right now. Cool. So what do we do here? We first have to import the router. It's as simple as just doing this. And remember, we're getting this router from the Express library. And we'll talk a bit more about Express a bit down the line. But essentially, what Express allows us to do, it just makes everything a whole lot simpler. And having this router already there, it makes our lives a lot easier. And like I said before, we need to import the Fortune controller because we want to provide operations that happen when we go to certain endpoints or routes. Yeah. So like I said before, we do have to provide a relative path. So that is in comparison to where this file is located, we need to try and refer to that file. So if you've done Linux and any other sort of terminal-based subjects, you would know a bit about relative paths and how to access certain paths in certain locations. But essentially .. means we're going back one folder. So by saying .. here, we're essentially going into the root of the server folder. And then if we put a /, we can access all the folders and all the files that are in the root of this folder. So if we collapse these, we're essentially, by going here with /, we can access all the things in the server root. We want to go into controllers. And then we also want to go into the Fortune controllers because we want to have direct access to that Fortune controller. Cool. And now this next part is as simple as doing router and defining the request. So for get all fortunes, that is a HTTP GET request. So that's just putting GET. we want to define the path that this sort of route is on. So that's /all, because we want to get all, so to speak. And we define the function that's going to happen once we get to that endpoint, which is, comes up, get all fortunes. Yep, cool. Likewise, we do have the same thing. So we'll just copy that line and paste it. But we also have random, which is get a random fortune. And once again, we do use get because it is a get request. But we don't use get all fortunes, we use get random fortune, which is right there. And so this defines another path that we can, our application can take. So what's the next one that we had there? We had create a new fortune. And we don't really get anything. We actually post data. That is a HTTP post request. And essentially that's another defined function by the router, which once again makes our lives a lot simpler. And what we tend to do is whenever we're posting data to a server, we don't necessarily give it a postage endpoint. We just leave it as an empty slash. So it is an empty endpoint that is exposed to the front end. So it makes Rachel's life a lot easier in terms of managing where that data goes. You can choose to change that. It just means things will change on the front end as well. And for this, we don't get a random fortune, we actually create a new fortune. Likewise, we have update, which is our next one. And for updating things that already exist in a database, or in our case, in our database, we use the HTTP put request. And put essentially knows that something already exists on a destination. It's just making some alterations. It's changing it. So HTTP put. And this time, remember how we provided the ID? We do :ID. And Rachel is going to do some work on the front end, which essentially will allow the request to have that ID stored within it. And essentially what this translates to is saying, yep, this will put it to a unique ID. Yep, and the fortune controller, we are using create a fortune. We are actually just doing update existing fortune. And likewise, put is very similar to delete because we do provide an ID, but there is a HTTP delete request, and that's what we do there. And the fortune controller, we provide the delete existing fortune option. And that's pretty much it for the router. I'll leave it up there just for a few seconds so you guys can have a look at it. Yeah, and I think that leaves one file, which is the server. So as you may recall, the layout of our application going from right to left, it was essentially, we started off with the model, we moved on to the controller, we then moved on to the router, which we have just completed, and now we're finally going to move on to the server. Cool. And yep, I'll switch over now back to slides so we can get through the examples and get onto the front end of coding. So quickly, we're just going to quickly cover NodeJS. NodeJS is, like I mentioned before, a back-end JavaScript runtime environment. It essentially means that you can run JavaScript code outside of your web browser, and it is cross-platform, meaning you can run the latest JavaScript features. You can run the latest JavaScript features on your browsers because browsers don't necessarily support the latest features of JavaScript. And the problem is, if you try to run a new function on JavaScript on a browser, the browser will not recognize it. So what Node.js does, it knows, okay, this is a new function that doesn't exist on browsers. Let's essentially effectively dumb it down and make it into, we'll change that new function into its original form using pre-existing functions so that it can run on older browsers. It's also based on Google Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine, which is why it makes such a good coding pair with Google Chrome. There's a lot of dynamic relationships between Google Chrome and Node.js, which is why I highly recommend for those of you who want to do a bit more Node.js coding to stick with Google Chrome and its developer console as well. So let's just run some JavaScript through our editor to see how this whole thing operates. Cool. So we'll head back to our file. And like I said, the server is represented by index.js. So here we are. And simply put, like we do with any programming language we learn for the first time, we start off with a simple hello world application. And in the case of JavaScript, printing to the console is console.log, and you provide the string or variable there. So if we save that, that's all cool. Nice. And what happens is if we run this file, so if we go to new terminal, and we can use the keyword of node, which is node, and we provide the file name. So as you can see, we're in the root of the folder. So we still need to go into the server folder. So we provide the server folder there, but we provide index.js. What's going to happen is when we run that, it outputs hello world. So essentially running JavaScript outside of a browser, which makes our lives a whole lot easier in terms of writing code, but also there's a lot that you can do with JavaScript outside of a browser, and NodeJS is essentially the foundation of that all. Cool. So we'll move back onto the next one, which is npm and npx. Now npm is Node's package manager, NodeJS package manager, and essentially allows us to install packages that allow us to develop the app that we're currently building or run it with ease. So there is a simple way to install packages. For example, Mongoose, which you saw earlier, and Express were some of the packages. And that's as simple as doing npm install Mongoose or npm install Express. And when we run this command, we install the package to our project, and it gets added to our project dependencies. So you're probably wondering, okay, project dependencies, what does that mean? And essentially, if you were to give your code to someone else, they would immediately know, okay, I need these packages to run this application. And this becomes really useful when you're deploying your application, so that the host or the server knows, or the database knows exactly what packages are required to run this application. And these project dependencies get saved in a file called package.json. And npx, which Rachel will mainly go into a bit later, is the Node.js package execute, and it comes with npm. So let's have a quick look at the package.json file. And the thing is, we've already provided you with one. We've already installed the necessary packages, and all you have to run is a simple command, if you haven't already, is npm install. That was a part of the setup guide, but essentially what it will do, not there, sorry. You want to do, go into the server folder, and you want to do npm install. And so what this will do, it will install all the necessary packages for the server. I'm not going to run it because we've already got all the packages we need. But essentially what that npm install does, it looks at the dependencies that exist. And it goes, okay, we need calls, we need .env, we need Express, we need Mongoose. And it automatically knows what versions to get, as specified right here, so that you can run the application with ease. Another cool thing about npm is also it automates scripts. So as you may know earlier, we did node server/index.js, but we've essentially defined a script here, a script called start, that runs this command automatically. So if we were to go back to Zoom's blocking everything once again. So let me just move things around real quick. Let me close the models and stuff. Yeah, if we go back to our index.js, as you can see here, we have our console.log. The package.json defined the start script to run this file. So if we ran this right now, it's going to execute this task, and it's going to take some time, but there you go, hello world. And this is essentially what we do to start our server once we start to add code here. Cool. So let's move on to the next slide, which is essentially covering importing things. So like we said before, importing things is like any other programming language. You can import libraries into variables and then use those variables. Excuse me. And as you can see here, we don't even have to save it to a variable. We can directly call functions from these libraries by just importing them with the require. So as you can see here, require.env.config. And we also can get functions from libraries and then use those functions, as you can see here. So let's type this up. So we'll hop over to VS Code for a second, and we'll get rid of this console log because we're actually going to start setting up our server. So as we see, it's express, it is require express. That was the first one that we needed. The second one that we needed was constant path. And save there. Cool, that's path. Sorry for those parts. Next thing that we required was cause. The next thing we required was mongoose, because we still need to connect to our database. And finally, our last section was require.env.config. As we saw earlier, and the last thing that we wrote, which was essentially we assign app to be the output of this function. Cool. And that's essentially what we wrote there. So I'll keep that up there for like 10 seconds while I just quickly go through everything again. Libraries, we can import them, we can save them to variables so we can access their methods. We don't even have to save them to variables. We can just run functions directly from them. And we can even get functions from libraries and use those functions like we did here with Express. Cool. So we'll move back over to the slides. And the next slide is going to cover Express, because we're going to go through these packages one by one that we wrote there. And I'll go back to it real quick. We're going to go through each of these packages quickly, just to make sure that you understand what we're actually doing here. So the first one we did was Express. So Express is a minimal web app framework. It is also the E of our MERN stack. It operates on the NodeJS environment, and it helps with developing server-side logic for our web application. As you saw in the router file, we use it for setting up routes for our application, and it provides a lot of abstraction. It essentially takes huge amounts of code that we would have to type and provides it in just a small function. So it makes our lives a lot easier when we're writing up stuff. So that's essentially Express and what we do with Express. So we'll just quickly look at what we can do with Express in terms of coding. So essentially what we do here is app.use. So as you may have noticed back over here, and I'll make this code a bit bigger so we can see it. We essentially do this express function and we assign it to an app. So essentially what happens here is this express function creates an express application, and we're saving that application to the app. Now, you may have heard, okay, we have the front end of our application and the back end of our application, but there are things that connect the two in between. And we usually refer to these pieces of software as middleware. And essentially what we can do here is we can use certain parts of our application. So as you can see here, we can say app.use, and we can use different forms of middleware. So essentially what we can do is we can mount a middleware function at a certain path. So normally the format follows app.use, you provide a path and you provide a function. But in the case of this, the path is optional, so you can just use the function. You can just use some middleware piece of software. So what we see here is essentially the use of middleware. And middleware is software that connects multiple applications, in this case, it's our front end and our back end. So as you can see here, we do express is URL encoded, and essentially we set that to be extended being false. So URL encoded, what that does, it passes incoming requests with URL encoded payloads. So when Rachel codes the front end, we will process her requests with URL encoded payloads, which allows her to add things to the URL, like the :ID, which allows us to get certain attributes from there. An extended being false is meaning that we can't encode arrays or other objects in the URL. It's basic variables. So extended being false gives us that sort of limitation there, and we set that there. The next thing, piece of middleware we use is JSON, which allows us to pass incoming requests with JSON payloads. So Rachel also sends some data with some JSON attached to it, and allows us to break down that JSON and use it in terms of sending off requests and such. And finally, we have app.listen, which essentially will listen to the port and notify us of any changes of sorts. Cool, so we'll get to adding this to the application real quick. So let's get typing on this. So the first thing that we type in is app.use. And like we said, express URL encoded, extended, sorry. We want extended to be false because we don't want anything other than just simple variables being encoded in the URL. We'll just copy that line because we can just do the second thing, which is express.json. And like I said, JSON allows us to pass incoming JSON payloads in requests. And that's simply that. And the next section here is going to be the port, which we simply do by app.listen. Oops, sorry. And we'll set that to 3001 for now. So what we're doing here is we're saying listen to this port, and we're going to just call a function as soon as that is done. And we're just going to say here, we're going to say server started on port. And we're going to say, oops, sorry, we're just going to put 3001 here. I'm just going to quickly note something here. This is not your standard like apostrophes and such. I am using the, I'm not sure what that key is called, but it's where the tilde key is, just above tab. So use that there because we want to essentially, this allows us to do some special things later on that we'll get into.
It's called a backtick.
A backtick, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, so that's pretty much that. So let's actually go back to MongoDB because I'm pretty sure our database is already set up right now. And we'll actually just hop on over real quick. Cool. So let's open up Mongo. There we go, cool. So as you can see, our database has been deployed. And as you can see, we've got some cool stuff here. Now you're probably wondering, okay, what do we do now? What's next, so to speak? First thing we need to do is we need to configure some things with the database. So the first thing we need to do is go to network access. You guys will see a screen like this with nothing there. But essentially you want to add an IP address. And what this IP address is, it essentially allows us to determine network access. Now, for the sake of this, we're going to click allow access from anywhere. But when it comes to doing these things for more security, if you were to do some more research and stuff, you'd know that you want to be very cautious with what you let into your database. But for the sake of this, we're going to allow access from anywhere. So this will just add that once we click it, and we just literally click confirm. And that will click say pending for a bit until it deploys those changes. But we're all good to move on to the next thing, which is going to the database access. So when we go to database access, you will not see that. You will see this screen. So the first thing that we want to do here is we're going to add a new user. And this is how we're going to access our database. So as you can see, we're going to go with the authentication method of having a password. So this is where we set up our credentials for our database. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to go with admin. And for our password, we're just going to go with TechSoc 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like that. And that's just for simplicity's sake. But of course, you do not want to share this information with anyone else if you're working on a proper full stack application, because this is credentials to access your database. And as you can see, we've given them the privileges of reading and writing to any database in this cluster. So you want to be really careful with this. So we're just going to click add user, and like that, we'll add a user that can access the database. Cool. And don't worry about anything else. We set up network access, we set up database access. The next thing that we want to do is we want to connect to the database. We want to have that connection established because that is essentially what we're missing from our application. So what we do here is we click connect and we click connect your application. And this will take us to this next page, which a lot of stuff here, let's be honest. But this string right here is very important. It's what we need. So we're going to copy that. We're going to copy that and we're going to head back to the slides for a bit. So we're going to move on to environment files. Now, environment files are very, very important. They essentially come with the .env package that we imported just a couple moments ago. And essentially, they allow us to store important environment variables in key value pairs. You don't need to worry. We've already added this to the git ignore, but essentially git ignore, it prevents certain files from being uploaded and pushed to any remote repositories. This is because it has sensitive information. Like we mentioned before, it'll have a username, password. It's a connection string, essentially. It has all these different things that are sensitive pieces of information that should never be pushed onto an online repo. It's mainly for allowing us to connect locally. And by adding it to a git ignore, we can be sure that it's not going to get pushed to a remote database. So as you can see here, we have an env file and we have it right here as well. So let's hop over to VS Code and let's create this environment file. So as you can see here, we have this, we have it here. Well, that's already there, so I'm just going to quickly delete that. But essentially, here we have it, right? And essentially where we want to create this environment file, if we have a look at the slides, is we want to create this environment file in the root of the server. So please keep that in mind, otherwise you will have issues with connecting. So what we can do is at the root of the server, let's minimize all these things. The root of the server, we just create a new file. And that file is literally called .env, pretty much it. And as you can see, it's a little bit grayed out, which essentially means, yeah, you don't need to worry about that being cloned or pushed anywhere, but that's fine. So you might have seen we had two key value pairs. The first one was MongoDB URI, which we can see here, MongoDB URI. And the second one was port. So you can probably see where this is going a bit, but we are going to get that string that we had here earlier. Copy that. Let's get that. Let's go back to this MongoDB URI file. Go equals. Just paste that in. Let's make that a bit more visible. So as you can see, we've just added that there. As you can see, it already has admin because it has our admin, but it doesn't have our password for security reasons, obviously. So what we're going to do is we're going to add our password, which we set to TechSoc 12345. We're going to save that. And port, as you saw earlier, we did 3001. So we're going to just set that here because that's something we can keep throughout our application. We can refer to it at any point in time. So essentially environment variables allow us to do environment files, or .env file allows us to access these at any point in time. And you can see it here. When we run that line that we saw earlier, which is require.env.config, it will read our environment file, it will pass the contents, and it will assign it to a process.env. And it will assign it to process.env, which is a process that runs in the background as a part of Node. And at any point in time, we can access those variables. So we can access the port and we can access the MongoDB URI. So let's quickly just type these two lines because we already have that first line. So let's hop on over. So as you can see, we have that there. So let's get the first one, which was the MongoDB URI. And that's equal to, as we said, it gets saved to the process variable. So process.environment.MongoDB URI. That's the first one. The second one, which you're going to just copy this, is port. And this gets the port in the file, likewise. But what happens if the port's not set? So this is something where we can provide an alternative. And that's as simple as doing two vertical lines. So in some languages, you might type the word or in JavaScript, you do two vertical lines to mean or. So essentially what will happen is this will say, is this, has this been set already? If it hasn't been set, we're just going to go with the one on the right. So it's this or this. So we've already set it, so it will all the time, it will essentially be 3001, but it's always good to provide that other option. So we'll put 5000 there. And cool, we've just set up our environment files. Cool. One thing that we're going to do now quickly is going to hop back over to MongoDB, and we're going to quickly head into the browse collections. Now, I mentioned collections a bit earlier. They represent the collection of our objects, which in our case is the fortunes. So let's browse collections. And this is actually just going to be empty because we have no data in our database. So we're just going to click add my own data. Now you can name your database name whatever you want, but we're going to call it fortunate because we are fortunate to have this database. And we're going to give it a collection name. And this collection name, as you may recall earlier, is what we put into the model right here, collection. So we want to keep.
Can you show the .env file again, or where you get the connection link?
Yeah, sure thing. So this is the .env file. So we put that in the root of the server folder. And this connection string we get right here, we actually get that from, actually, I'll quickly finish, quickly cancel that real quick, because we can always come back to that. Where am I again? Yes, just go back to overview. Oh, sorry, not overview. We'll just go back to databases. That's what we need to do. Yeah. We click this connect option here next to our cluster, and this window will pop up. We're not using the MongoDB shell, and we're not using MongoDB Compass. We are just connecting to our application using MongoDB's native drivers. So we'll just click that, and it'll take you to this page. You don't need to worry about this Node version. If you follow the setup guide, you'll be running the latest version of Node. So that's already fine. This is the code that we need. So you can just simply copy it, and you can go back and you can paste it. Two key things to remember then is that you have the user that we set in the database access and the password, which you've also set in the database access. So those two things need to be changed. And that's how you set up the URI. Cool. So we'll head back to creating the database real quick. So we're back on this homepage. We'll go browse collections like I mentioned before. And it's going to retrieve a list of databases. There's nothing here. So we'll add our own data. Click that. And the database name, we're just going to call this fortunate. That's all cool. And then the collection name, we're going to call this, we're going to match, what we have in the file. And as you can see in this file, we have the name as fortunes. And this essentially, it makes sure that we are having that one-to-one connection. There is no potential room for error. So click that, and we click create. And what this will do is it will create a collection for us within here. And as you can see, it goes fortunate.fortunes, and this is our collection. And in here, we can insert as many documents as we like, many representations of our fortunes. So we can insert a fortune. So what this does here is essentially it's allowing us to add these new properties, so to speak. So let's just click this add button. We'll add a field after ID. And the first field that we have, and the only field that we have other than the ID, if you remember correctly, was the fortune name, which we just have here. So we've just set the fortune name, but we want to provide it with a value. So this can be, we wish, a lot of good luck is going to come your way. That's one fortune. So we can click insert. And what this does, it will create a new document saying, hey, this is your fortune. And we have one representation. And of course, we can keep making more and more fortunes, but we're just going to make 2 more for the sake of time. So we're going to just click this clone button so we don't have to retype fortune name. We can just change this one up. So we click clone document there, and we're just going to change this to another fortune. Let's go with something. You will attend 5 more TechSoc events in the semester. That's another fortune that we have there. And as you can see, even though we cloned it, the ID does change because it understands that they cannot have the same ID. And one more, we'll just clone it and we'll say, you will learn some wise things from an amazing teacher called Rachel. Well, I hope I'm typing that correctly. I can't see anything anymore. And fingers crossed, yes. So we've got 3 fortunes now in the database, and they all have fortune name. So that's all there. Now there's a couple more things that we need to do. So this fortune database name, the one that you set just a few moments ago, we're going to copy that because we need to actually go to the connection string and make one more adjustment. So we got the database name. We'll go to the environment file, which is right here. And you can see this my first database. You're going to want to change that to your database name, which in our case is fortunate. And simple as saving that. So that's pretty much the MongoDB side of things on the website. That's pretty much done. We've set that up. Let's move on to the next section of these slides, which essentially covers Mongoose. And we're continuing to use Mongoose. Mongoose.connect takes in the connection string that we have from the environment file. And you can also have some parameters. The thing is, with these parameters, they pretty much mean nothing. The only reason why we add these parameters is because these features have been deprecated, and we don't want these warnings flooding our screen. Otherwise, we get a bit worried. So we're just gonna do that there. And finally, this connection here. And once we do this connect function, there is a connection attribute that is accessible, which allows us to inspect that connection and monitor that connection. And we can see, okay, once it's open, once it's been closed, we can send different messages and stuff. So let's get to typing this into the into index.js. Cool. So we'll go below here real quick. Do it here because we want to have it here. So as you can see, we imported Mongoose. We do .connect. The first thing that we provide is the MongoDB URI. And the next thing we provide is the connection options, which we have defined here. And I will paste this, into the chat because I do know that it's really unnecessary. It's essentially mainly to get rid of any deprecated resources. Probably the only interesting thing about this is that this replaces our update function that we use in the controller. But I shall send this into the Zoom chat real quick. Cool. So you can just add that in the middle here, next to the MongoDB connect. And essentially what this allows you to do is it will just essentially remove a bunch of warnings from the application. The next thing that we want to do is we want to get that connection. Yep. And we want to do some things with that connection. So we say once that connection is open. Sorry, give it a second. Once that connection is open, right, we are going to just say, console.log, and we're going to say MongoDB connection. Cool. And that is pretty much that right there for the MongoDB connection. Now, there are a few more things that we just need to quickly go over before we get into the front end of things. So the next thing is cause and path. Now, what is cause? Now, this is really important. This is probably the main thing that's going to get your application running in the end. Cause stands for cross-origin, I think I froze. So cross-origin resource sharing, which essentially is a HTTP function that allows the server to indicate any other origins, in our case port, than its own from which a browser should permit loading of resources. Now that's a mouthful, so I'm gonna put it into a much shorter and more understandable term. Essentially, our application, which we set, is running on port 3001. Now, the main thing is Rachel could also be running an application, her front end, on the port 3000. But those two are different ports, which essentially means they are cross-origin. And the thing is, browsers do not like cross-origin resource sharing, meaning it won't like it when Rachel's front end fetches, Rachel's front end codes fetches things from the backend Fortune cookies and the database. It also won't like it when the backend that we've just coded sends things to the front end that we're also going to be coding. So in this case, essentially what the issue is that we need some way to allow this resource sharing to occur. And that's what cause is used for. Simple as writing app.use cause, which is causes another middleware. It alleviates that issue and allows us to communicate over those two mediums. And finally, path. Now, Rachel's going to get into a bit more detail in regards to this. I'm going to directly copy these lines into the chat. But essentially what we need to know here is that we're essentially setting up the apps to use the latest build files. And these build files are from the front end, so it's actual HTML and CSS that Rachel's code will generate. So we can use it and we can show something on the front end. Cool. So we shall go back to here, and we want to add one thing here, which is, oops, sorry. Use, and as we saw above there, we imported cause, and then we also want to bring in the path to ensure that we are using our application. Sorry, we can host the correct HTML files and such. Now, there is one final thing that we're going to do before we test it out, which is the next slide. And I need to send that into the chat. My bad. I'll send that into the chat.
Hey, Seth, can you scroll down to the last part?
Yes, scroll down.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I just sent these two lines into the chat. Feel free to just paste it in before this listen section.
Also, you've been sending the code to me through Zoom direct message. It's okay. I got it.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Rachel. Basically, what we need to do as the final step is we need to set up the routes, which, as you may remember, we had the /or/random and the other ones, but we didn't define a base URL for our application. So we are just going to import those routes that we created, the router, sorry. So we're going to do Fortune router, so we'll require, and we're going to go into the routes folder, and we're going to get the fortunes. And then finally, we're going to do app.use, and this is where we provide a path to our middleware. We're going to say that once you access our middleware from here, you're going to be able to use the routes that we have defined in the router. So just these two lines right here that we're going to add. And that essentially connects everything together. Everything just comes together with those two lines. So I'll leave that there for a bit, just for like 10, 15 seconds. Feel free to take a screenshot or whatnot. But essentially what this does, it allows us to connect to our router, which connects to our controller, which connects to our model. And as a result, we finally have our connection to everything's connected on the back end. Cool. So I think that's pretty much everything from my end, but we still have one thing to do. Let's test it out. So as you can see here, we've finished typing everything up. We're in the server folder, and we're just going to run npm start. I hope this works, because it's going to be interesting if it does. Wonderful. So as you can see, it says here that the server has started on port 3001, which is right here, and the MongoDB connection was successful, which is right here. And this is just another example of asynchronous functions, right? Because essentially what happens here is with once, this will only occur once the connection is open. So the code continues to run. This will get executed and this will run first. And then once the connection is open, this will run. So that's why we had this getting logged after this one. Cool. So now this is actually accessible. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and open a new tab. In my case, it's going to be Firefox.
Hey, Hasith, do we use the port variable defined under MongoDB URI?
Yes. Oh, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. Yes. So here we essentially just do port in caps, because what we did up here was we assigned that to a variable. And here we put the $, we put the curly brackets, which essentially that's what these backticks are for. Thank you, Rachel. And it allows us to put variables directly into the strings that we type. So we can just put it right here. And we can save it, and everything should be all good to go, I think. Yep. So let's just close that real quick, and let's restart the server. So this will run. Server started on port 3001C, and now we're not using the 3001 literally. We're actually using the environment variable, and MongoDB's connection was successful. So what we're going to do is we're going to go localhost 3001 API fortunes, and let's try to get all fortunes. As you can see, we've actually successfully reached one of the endpoints, which is the all, which will get all the fortunes. So as you can see, a lot of good luck is going to come your way. You will attend 5 more TechSoc events in the semester, and you will learn some wise things from an amazing teacher called Rachel. The next one that we can test is random. If I can spell random. And there you go. And every time we actually fetch this, oh wait, this is going to have cache, my bad. Oh no, it doesn't, never mind. Because there's only 3, it's a likelihood that we get the same random one many times. But yeah, so as you can see, every time we access it, we get a random one. And the other 3, which was update, create, and delete, unfortunately, we cannot test that directly in our browser, because every time we actually type something up here, it's running a GET request. To do something like doing an update, doing a put, delete, or create request, which is post, we need to use other tools such as Postman. So I highly recommend, if you want to give it a try, download Postman, and you can see how this all works. But other than that, after a very, very long time spending some time on the front-end code, over to you, Rachel. Sorry, a lot of time in the back-end code. That's on me.
Yeah, we probably might not have enough time to get the entire front end sorted, but we'll do our best. And because the event does end at 8 p.m., we'll continue to talk, and this session will be recorded, so it'll be released in the next week or so, if you have to leave after 8.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do you want to take over screen share?
Yes, I will.
Sure.
Okay, give me 1 second.
No worries.
Alrighty, I'll just leave it on the Canva slide for now. Cool. So thanks, Asif, for creating for the back end. Now let's talk about the front end of our app, where you, the user, will be able to interact with the data. Firstly, I'm going to grab Hasith's changes by going into my terminal.
Give me a second while I git push it.
Oh yes, I'll wait for you to do that. So yeah, I guess I'll talk about React a bit first. So React is the R as in MERN stack of web technologies. React is a really popular web design framework that's really in demand right now. So I hope you get a lot out of tonight's workshop. Unfortunately, as I said before, we won't have enough time to cover everything, but we'll release a recording for those who can't stay back. Cool. So what is React? React is basically a JavaScript library for building user interfaces, and it uses components to create I guess build your interface bit by bit. So it's really helpful when you need to reuse pieces of similar I guess user interface components. So for example, if you have, say there's a Google screenshot, for example, if you have these tabs, but maybe you could use maybe you could use the same component to display all those tabs instead of copy and pasting, I don't know, a list item or something like that in HTML. Yeah, cool. So
should be able to get pull now.
Okay, cool. I'll do that. So save time. Cool. So normally to start a new ReactJS project, you'd type in npx create React app, and then you'd name it whatever you like. So npx is, as Hasith mentioned before, something that runs commands in npm packages. So create React app is a package that someone who's worked on React has made, which generates a lot of our starter code. Yeah, and all the default files that we need to get started. However, for us tonight, it'll be a lot easier starting with some skeleton code that we prepared. Again, it takes a lot of time to set it up from scratch, but we have some starter code that we've worked on to start from tonight. So yeah, also I'm not going to be copy and pasting snippets, so don't worry. I will explain each section so that you know what each part does, even if it's already in the skeleton. All right, so there's a few key parts that put together the basics of React. We have components. So for example, we have an app component. And these components have different things inside of them. For example, we'll have states, and they return something called JSX, which I'll get to in a second. So the way React works is that it all starts from this app component that makes up like the root of I guess you compare it to the root of your HTML page. So yeah, similarly to the server project, it starts at the index.js, and you can see here how it uses a React DOM package that it's imported from the ReactJS library, and it uses React code here that's also imported from npm library, and then renders the app component. And app components, you render them similar to like ordinary HTML tags. So whatever we create in here, whatever we return in here will be displayed when we render this thing. Okay, cool. So more on components. So they're the most important part of React because they're essentially the building blocks that make up the UIs. You can see them in our components folder over here. We have a couple of, I guess, skeleton code, you can call it, of some components we've already half set up, and we'll be going through tonight. So you can see in our app.js, it's as a function, like I said, and it returns something called JSX. Now, JSX is an extension of JavaScript, and it's HTML-like. So you can type on your HTML, for example, you can type in a p tag, but you can also type in JavaScript and run JavaScript using these curly brackets. So you can go console log blah or whatever like that in like normal JavaScript. You can also display components dynamically with state and props, which I'll get to later. And you can also, like I said, use the curly brackets to run ordinary JavaScript. You can also display variables that you can set up with code. So for example, if I just make a variable called number equals 10. I could display whatever value is in number on the page just by doing that with the curly brackets. And if 10 ever gets changed to some other number, it'll automatically re-render to be up to date. So yeah, also one other thing to note, JSX is surrounded by these round brackets, so it doesn't get confused with other code. Yeah, so another thing to note is that we have our class name. So you know how in HTML, how you use CSS and other things to style your page, and you'll use classes to attach those styles to certain elements to make them look pretty. Same kind of situation in JSX, except instead of using class, we have to use something else called class name. It's different because JSX, as I mentioned, is basically JavaScript. And so because JavaScript already has a keyword class, we can't really use it for this kind of usage. So class name is the same thing as a HTML class, just a different word. And so as an example, let's do some things in our fortune cookie component. Actually, first, let's put the fortune cookie component in here first. So you can see at the top, it's not open fortune, it's fortune cookie. And change that name to fortune cookie. So that's the component we're going to show first, fortune cookie. Oh, and we need to use angle brackets like that. And actually, let's show it on, here we go. npm, I don't have to cd to run the whole thing all together. You have to cd into your client folder, and you can see I'm in the client folder now, and then npm start. And that's a script from, oh, I've forgotten to npm install first. Yeah, so this is a step that you should probably do before you try to run the projects. And I'll also need to cd into the server and do that as well. Can you see that node modules folder that just popped up? That's from the npm packages installing. I'll cd into server and do the same. Anyways, while we're waiting for that to load, I can show you the fortune cookie component. So if we go into the fortune cookie folder in our components folder, you'll see there's a bunch of skeleton code already here. So this is our fortune cookie component. It's got things like state, and I'll explain those in a bit. But most importantly for now, it's returning our JSX. So we have an open fortune div, we have our heading, we have some stuff that's commented out, and we also have a couple of other things that we'll add to in a moment after these things. Unfortunately, they take a little while to load. What can I explain to you guys while this is loading? I guess I can explain to you guys state. So state is something that is kind of like the variables in a component. So you'll use these to, I guess, display values or change up the JSX that's returned with these states. So use state is a hook, is something called a React hook. It's basically a function that's imported from the React library. And you can see up here, we've imported it there, and we can use that here. And what the useState function returns is two things. Firstly, it's a variable that holds the value of the state. And then the second thing is a function that allows you to set and, like, I guess, manipulate whatever the value of the state is. So when you go use state, we usually put the initial state in there. So for selected fortune, it's going to be an empty string. And for cookie is open, it'll be a Boolean value. So we'll put false for now. Yeah, cookie is open. That's a naming convention. Because JavaScript, you can't really tell what types things are. For example, if things are a number or a string, It really helps to use naming conventions like cookie is open, which is like a yes or no thing, which is like a Boolean thing. All right, now that those things have loaded, let's npm start. Oh, what's this? That's fine. npm start there as well. Yes. Okay, that's still loading, and something is happening here. The thing is, the error that some of you guys got. Make sure the first parameter to Mongo connect is a string. Okay, let's fix that. What do we got? Index.js. What is it? Mongoose connect.
You're missing the environment file.
Environment file.
You're missing
env file. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's do that.
I'll send you the connection string.
Okay. Let's go new file. .env.
Yeah. Oh, wait, let me send it on Zoom.
Yes, please.
Zoom.
Thank you. Cool. Let me save that and rerun this. Can't resolve. Oh, that's probably because I have different inputs here. Okay.
Yeah.
So that one is the C fortunes. Fortune text is not defined. Okay. This might be from over here. Okay, we'll just fix these to fix these errors so we can show you. If you're having the same problem, let me know. Sif will let me know.
Yeah.
Okay, all these kind of warnings. What's the issue, Dylan? Okay, yeah. So if you go to API functions, the update fortune, it couldn't find fortune text, so we got to put it in the brackets there.
Also, Rachel, you have the same port for both the back end and the front end. So you need to go into the environment file and change it to 3002.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Perfect.
I'll put it through 3.
Nice.
Because the front end is on 2.
Okay.
Did that get fixed, Dylan? If you change that?
Yeah, continue ahead. I'll let you know if anyone's having any issues.
Refresh. Yay, all right, cool. So we're showing our app.js. You know what, I'll move this to a side. We're showing our app.js, which is showing our fortune cookie component. Yay, all right, cool. So the next thing we want to do is actually, I'll bring up my slides again because these have a screenshot of our end product that we're going to try and create. Cool. So in our find a fortune, in our fortune cookie component, we have the heading here, we have the image, and we have a button that we can click and that'll obviously open the cookie. So we don't have that yet. So first of all, let's do the image first. Close that. Okay, cool. Have more space. So you'll notice here there's these curly braces and the /*. We'll just get rid of that. That's just commenting. That's JSX's version of commenting out things. So you'll notice here as well, in ordinary HTML, when you type in the source, you usually type it in like a path to the image in a string format. But in ReactJS, in JSX, sorry, we have to do it a different way because it doesn't like that. So what I've done here is I've imported it at the top. So this is the relative path to the fortune cookie images. You see I have an images folder, we have a couple of images in there. So that's import fortune cookie from blah file path, and I've got the two images here that we want. So let's put fortune cookie in there, save, it'll update, and we have an image. Yay, cool. And we'll also we'll copy that line and we'll show the other one for now as well. Actually, no, we won't. I'll go over that in a second. So we want to I've lost myself. Okay, so let's display things based on our states. So state, like I said before, it's kind of like a variable for the current the current state of our component. So if a cookie is open, then maybe we want a different image to show, and we want the text of the fortune to appear. So what we can do is we can, so this is set to false at the moment. So I like to use this fun thing called a ternary operator. If you haven't heard of it before, it's basically like shorthand for an if statement. So what you do to base it on the cookie is open state or variable. If it's true, then we'll show the fortune cookie, or no, we'll show the open fortune cookie. And if it's false, so we put a colon there, and we'll do fortune cookie. So if we save that, open fortune cookie is not defined. That's because I didn't use capitals. Oh yeah, not that. Just that. Okay, that should appear now. Hey, nice. Okay, so our fortune cookie is false. It is not open. So if we change that to true, it is open. Cool. So now we want to be able to control that on the screen. And what we can do is use the open cookie button to do so. Now in ordinary HTML, to make a button do something, you'd use onClick. It's a similar thing in JSX, but as my autocorrect is suggesting, we use a capital letter. And we also, instead of giving it quotes and putting JS things in here, we have to give it a callback function. So that's essentially saying, it's kind of like giving something a job to do later. So instead of, okay, you know what, I'll just code it and we'll explain as I go. So I'll give it the open cookie function. Oops. Open cookie. And so this is telling the button whenever it gets clicked, then you run the open cookie function. So let's just test that it's connected. Button. Cool, and we'll go in here. We can open up our console log. You can do the same thing by just going right click, inspect element. Ignore, that's a bunch of warnings, but that's okay, we'll get to that. It's because there's a bunch of things that are declared but haven't been used yet because we haven't got to them. So if we go open cookie, we can see it's printed, so it's connected. Cool. So yeah, main thing we want to do in this function, in this function, is to, oh, give me 1 second. File windows everywhere. Yeah, so firstly, we want to select a fortune to display. And the second thing we want to do is open the cookie. So turn the cookie is open state to true or false, given that we turn it back to the correct initial state. Okay, so this is the part where we dive into what the code that Hasith's worked on. So, hold on. Yep. So if we open up API functions, and the reason these are separated is because it's a lot cleaner to have all your API calls in one file and then call those in all the other places that you need them to be, rather than having these messy async functions everywhere in your components. So that's what we're doing. Bigger. Okay, cool. So you can see here that we have a get fortunes function already, and that's basically just to allow us to talk it through before we make our get random fortune function. So firstly we have our URL that we're going to send a web request to, and that's based off our base URL, and then the /all that Hasif was talking about when he was doing the routing things. So using that, we'll go to use our fetch API. So fetch is something that's inbuilt to all browsers. And so you can use this whenever you're using JavaScript, really. It sends web requests to whatever URL you put it in. It also is a promise. So what Hasif said, basically, it sends the web request, and then it's like, I promise I'll come back with the data that you wanted. So what we need to do is we say await. So that means that we're waiting for it to come back. Because if we don't put that there, then when it gets to results, okay, wait, let me rephrase this. So the fetch URL returns some data, and then this is where the .then callback comes in. So this function that we put in here is saying take whatever results that the fetch response comes back with, and then we'll turn it into JSON, and then we'll return it to whatever variable you're going to put it in. So this results variable here. Yeah, and that's what that get all fortunes function returns. So for the get random fortune, we're going to do exactly the same thing. And instead of all, we're going to put random, which I believe that's what the route was. So we'll save that. And we'll come back to our fortune cookie file. And so we only want to fetch a new random fortune when the cookie is closed. So, well, not closed, but like not open. So we'll put an if statement here. So if cookie is open, false, then we will, okay, so this is the part about imports. So because that get random fortune is in another file, we have to use this import line at the top here to import it. So, no, there was something about this part that was tricky. Okay, yes, so that's right. Because this is an async function, we have to do some extra things to, I guess, make it simpler for us. So in our fortune cookie component, we also have this function called select fortune, and you'll notice it's got the async thing. So this is what allows us to run other asynchronous functions. So here, go get random fortune, we run that function. Okay, so because it's a promise, we can give it a callback to do. Okay, so because random fortune might take a long time to do things, we need to give it a task to do after get random fortune has done its thing. So we go .then, and then in here we give it an arrow function to do things with whatever it returns. So whatever it returns, let's call it fortune, and we'll take that, and this is where we can use the setter function that use state returns. So set selected fortune. Oh no, yes, set selected fortune. And then we'll take the fortune thing that it returns, and we'll go .fortune name. And this is because the fortune object that get random function returns is well, an object. So we can't just say fortune because it won't accept it because it's not a string, or it won't display properly because it's not just a string. So to get just the string, we have to use .fortune name to grab that value. So back to our open cookie function, we use select fortune. We'll run that code. And then after that, actually, let's put that in there. And then when we open the cookie, we use the other setter function that open cookie is open state gives us. That cookie is open, and we turn that to true. Okay, cool. So if we save that, refresh this, open the cookie. Aha. So the image changed because the cookie is open state changed, but we forgot to add our fortune text. So I have this H2 element there, and let's put that in. So this thing we also want to display based on whether the cookie is open or not. So we'll do the same kind of thing. Cookie is open, yes or no question mark. And then if the cookie is open, we'll return the selected fortune. If not, we'll return nothing. So it'll be nothing there. Okay, now let's refresh that, open the cookie, and it has not selected fortune. Is that because I didn't run this thing again? Okay, so let's try this again. Open the cookie. We still don't have that text. Now, why is that? Get random fortune. Is our console log saying anything? Aha. API function. Now, this is why it's important to return errors.
You have to change the port on the base URL.
The base URL. Oh, yes, up here. Yes, that's true. Thank you. 203. Nice. Okay, it looks like there's no error. So refresh this, and then open cookie. Hey, there we go. We have retrieved a random fortune from the database. And I've just noticed that it's past 8. So what I'll quickly do is that if some of you have to leave, that's not a problem. Like I said before, this event is pre-recorded, is going to be recorded, and we'll release that sometime in the next week. But what I'll do is that I'll quickly plug our next events. Hey, so we have a lot coming up these next few weeks. We're really excited for semester 2. So we have our first community catch-up session of 2021. We ran this last year with a couple other IT societies. If you're a member of those societies, you'll know what we mean. It's an initiative that we're aiming to build a community for women in tech. And this first session, we're going to be chatting with some alumni and industry reps about anything really, and just create a community that we can all chat in and be supported. What was the catchphrase for it? Support, connect, and inspire women. So if you're interested in that, hope to see you there. Just a note here, after the full stack dev workshop, unfortunately the test-driven development workshop with Record Point has changed to a software engineering panel with Record Point instead. So software engineering is such a broad career, so hopefully if you join, you'll be able to get some really good insights out of that. So it should be a good one. And also the big project. So this is if you were a member of our society last year, this will be familiar. We're running it again. It's shortened to a 4-week initiative this time, where you'll be given a prompt, and it's kind of basically like a hackathon stretched over 4 weeks. So it'll give you a lot of time to create a high fidelity prototype essentially. And we'll be giving industry workshops where some of our sponsors or some speakers from the industry will come in and talk about design thinking processes, as well as what was the third one? How to pitch your idea to a panel of speakers. So for our the final stage of our big project is you'll be giving a talk about your high fidelity project to some industry reps, and you'll be getting lots of really amazing feedback from them if it's anything like last year's. Lastly, last event to plug, we also have an event with another one of our sponsors, VMware, and this will be on data center virtualization. So if you're interested at all in that field, it's really good to get certifications on because they're really popular in the industry, and it's a good resume booster essentially, and you learn a lot from them. So they're giving a talk on their certifications as well as going into detail about some of the content of one of the entry-level ones if you're interested in any of that. Yeah, so that was a quick spiel on some of our upcoming events. We're really excited for them to happen. All the details are on our Facebook page, as well as in the announcements channel of our Discord. And yeah, so okay, this is not the end of the workshop if you're staying past this, but we do have a feedback form. Likes, dislikes, and improvements all welcome. So please, if you have anything to say about this event, please let us know your thoughts. And always join our Discord if you haven't already. We're fun to chat with. And after the event, if you still have any questions, of course, feel free to pop your questions in the Discord as well. There'll be lots of people who will be happy to help. All right, so if you have to leave now, thank you so much for coming. But we will continue talking about the front end. If you're staying on, hopefully you'll get some more out of that. Okay, cool. Okay, so back to the code. Let's do something for this reset button here. So obviously we click open the cookie. It's open now. We can't do anything else for the moment. So let's change that. So same thing for the open the cookie button. We'll have an on click to give it an action. I'll put the callback in a curly brackets, reset cookie. And this one is essentially changing these back to their original states. So set cookies open false. Set selected fortune to nothing, to an empty string. Okay, so we'll be able to do things with that. Open the cookie, reset the cookie. Nice. And you might also, actually no, I'll skip this part because it works just as it is. So that's essentially our fortune cookie component. So that's the first part of our application. Now for the rest of it. So we've done a part of the read functionality. Now for the create, update, and delete part of the app. So, okay, let me get my bearings again. Okay, second part of the app. So we have our fortunes list. So back in our screenshots here, we have a section that we want to show all of the list of all the fortunes. We want to be able to add a fortune and edit and delete them. So let's get on to that. So in our see fortunes property, let's put this on the app. Sorry, I'm a bit tired right now, but let's go. See fortune. So that's a component we want in our app component. I'll give it the slash. Does that appear? Yes, it does. We have the basis of it right there. Cool. So we go back to here, and we want the show fortunes list to only appear when we click this show fortunes button. Right now, it's not doing anything. So let's change that. Show fortunes button, same as before, on click. We'll give it the curly brackets so we can do something with it. Okay, this is where I'm gonna get a little lazy. So a callback function is basically, we can also do callback functions using arrow functions like this. So the round brackets, we have something that it takes in. We're not gonna give it anything. And then this curly brackets is where we run our JS code that we want it to run. So basically, set is showing fortunes to whatever is showing fortunes is not currently at the moment. So not set is showing fortunes. Okay, cool. So that state is now changed, but we don't use that state anywhere. What we can also do with class names is you can edit them using JavaScript logic in your components. So this div right here, that contains this fortunes heading and the add fortunes input section. So let's use that. We can control the class name. Now, if you remember how to control something based on a Boolean, it's the same kind of strategy. So let's use a ternary again. Is showing fortunes? Question mark. So if it is showing fortunes, then the class name is nothing, no changes, because it shows as it is right now. But if it's not, let me show you my app.css file that I've pre-prepared. They have a bunch of classes, but what we need right now is this hidden class. So we go back to see fortunes, and we change, whoopsie. Yeah, and then so if showing fortunes is false, then we go hidden. So this returns the word hidden, which will then be given to the class name. So when it's false, the class name will be hidden, essentially. So save that, and let's see if it works. Do I have to refresh, maybe? And there is something wrong. Is showing fortunes. Aha, there is no initial state. That's what's wrong. Yeah, so use state. I've left it empty, and I've left most of the use states empty in the skeleton code, but it's important to fill it with the initial state. So show fortunes. I had to refresh this as well. And it's not happening. Should be. Okay, maybe let's take this out into a separate function so we can see what's happening. So function toggle show fortunes, let's call it. And we'll just make it do this. That there, oh, not that part. We'll run this line. Instead of giving it a callback, we put toggle show fortunes. It's still not happening. As if, do you have any clue what's going on?
I'm on mute. Yeah, the pink text on line 9, it's meant to be is showing fortunes, not set is showing fortunes.
I see it.
Yeah.
Helps to this is why pair programming is so popular.
Yeah. Sorry, I was on mute. I was talking for like 30 seconds. Yeah, sorry about that.
And so is my app.css that's imported there. It should work. Is showing fortunes, set is showing fortunes. Okay, anyways, that's a minor detail. We can save that for later when we have time to debug. So I guess the next part would be let's render our actual list of fortunes. So what we'll need for this is something called, let me get back to our app.js. Nope, it's not there either. Okay. That's okay. We only need it in this one. So we're using another hook called useEffect. And something that React has is when you display components, it's something called unmounting and mounting. So like think of it as taking your component on and off the page of taking it off on and off the page. But React has kindly enough bundled it into one function that we can use called the useEffect function. And so in here we have to, like I said, it's from the React library, so we have to import it as well. So let's put it up there next to the useState. So useEffect, it takes a callback function. So an arrow, we can define this using an arrow function. And so in here, it'll do a bunch of things that will happen whenever the component refreshes, I think is the best way to say it. So whenever the component refreshes, we want it to get fortunes. So from the database. So let's go back to our app.functions file, and we can get the get fortunes. And firstly, we need to import it from that file as well. So import. Now we need to use curly brackets, get fortunes. Oh, nice, thanks autocorrect. Yeah, so basically get fortunes is the function imported from the path out of the components folder and into the API connections folder and into API functions folder. Functions file, sorry. So yeah, now that we have that available to use, let's do it in here. Get fortunes. We run that. And so because, again, it's a promise, so let's use the then promise to give it a action to do when the first promise comes back. It's, yeah, like I said, promises are confusing. So don't worry if you don't get it the first time. It does take a bit of practice. So when we finish to get fortunes, it'll do some actions that we're defining here. And we want to set it to fortunes. So let's add a state in here and fortunes and set fortunes. So these are the two things that useState returns, as I mentioned before. And we'll set that initially to an empty array, so we don't get any errors if nothing comes back. So let's go set fortunes, and we give it the data that get fortunes returns. So let's name it fortunes so that we know what we're talking about instead of just a generic data. And we set that into the set fortunes function. Okay, now that we have that there, we need to display it on the page. Now, because it's an array and we don't know how long it is, we don't just want to, I don't know, give it paragraphs and copy paste that however many times we think that the fortunes will come. Instead, we'll rely on the fortunes array itself. So we'll go fortunes. Actually, no, this is JavaScript code, so we have to wrap it in the curly brackets. Fortunes.map. Now, map is a JavaScript array function, and it allows you to essentially, we treat it as like a for loop, basically. So it'll, for each fortune, it'll take the fortune, and again, another callback. So we'll use arrow function. It requires a callback, so we'll use an arrow function. So for each fortune, we want to return, let's put this in a p tag for now. Curly brackets to add the value. So that'll just appear in curly brackets. I mean, that should just appear in fortune. Okay, we're not getting anything there. So let's check. Control-Shift-I. Not say anything there. Okay. All right, what are we missing? API functions. get fortunes. Not using the right function. Aha, okay, so we have something here to do with the map. Array prototype map expects return value from arrow function.
So you're going to return the, yep.
So maybe instead of using the curly brackets, which, okay, I know the problem here. So curly brackets is something that we use to indicate that you're running some JS code, some JavaScript code, instead of returning some JSX, which usually should be round brackets. But because it's just one line, let's just leave it as no brackets around that. Okay, it refreshes. Surely that's a good sign. No, it's not. There's lots of red. Aha, I know the reason. Okay, so back to the API functions, the get fortune function. Remember how we said it returns the array of objects, because it's not just a fortune name, the text itself, it comes with, like, I don't know, ID and some other generated stuff that MongoDB might make for it. So we need to extract the fortune name. And the fortune name comes from, if we go to models, the fortune name comes from this thing back in the schema that we defined earlier. So I'll close that file, we don't need that anymore. Fortune name, you should be able to just grab the text now. Okay, we have something. Hey, look at that, we have some text here. So that's just in a boring p tag. Let's change that to something else. We have a pre-prepared fortune card component that we can use. So we'll go back to see fortunes, and to use the fortune card in this component, we have to firstly import it at the top there. I'll move this down so you can see the whole file. Okay, yeah, so import it from the top there. And instead of doing a P, we go fortune card. All right, cool. So there are fortune cards. And as you can see, it says some text, some text, some text, instead of the fortunes that we want it to. So that kind of leads to our next part of the application, which is going to the finer details, such as our fortune card component. So in here, we have some empty states. So let's fill in the initial state so we don't get any errors in the future. It is editing, that's a Boolean. We're going to check that as false for now. New fortune, that's obviously, well, not obviously, but that is our, whatever text we're going to put in here to edit the thing. So it's going to be text, so it's a string. We'll put an empty quote marks there. Okay, so there's a bunch of things we have to do in this component. So to get started, we need to extract, okay, so back in our see fortunes thing, it just has the fortune card. We need to give it, yeah, so we need to give it the information that the fortune has. Now we can do it this way, which you can use in here using, I think it's this props.children or something like that. But we can do it a different way, which looks a lot cleaner, in my opinion. Get rid of that. And we'll give it some props. Oh, props is short for properties, by the way. Just fun fact. Fortune card, let's give it a fortune is fortune. I will just slip it right in there. Not like that. Fortune in the curly brackets. Yeah, so once we go back to our fortune card, it'll be able to, so this props is what we're talking about. So in the props, what do I call it? Argument, parameter, is where all this data that's passed into components this way is, I guess, shown. So what we can do is we can extract it using some funky syntax. For example, this curly brackets, we can do fortune. Wait, so firstly, the fortune that we're passing in, that has two things. We have an ID and we have a fortune name. So those are the two things that are in that fortune that we're passing in from the fortunes array. So we can extract that and we use props. And because it's the fortune is not, the props is not entirely just that one fortune, it can be several different things. So it's a object. So the key, yes, key that our fortune object is under would be fortune, whatever we defined it as here, a semicolon. So whenever we use these variable names, it'll be referring to whatever we passed in through there. So now back to our JSX, where we can actually display what we're passing through. We can use the curly brackets to show show variable values, fortune name, and now we can display it based on whatever is being passed in. Hey, nice. See, we have the actual fortune text in there now. Cool. And you'll notice there are some buttons as well as this edit fortune part to get to. Now this is okay, you know what, we'll pause this for a second. We'll do the create first, because that's kind of makes things easier to understand. Makes the update and delete part easier to understand anyways. So in our C fortunes file, in our C fortunes component, we also return this add fortune component imported from the add fortune file. So we go add fortune.js, we have our add fortune component, and it's pretty simple. I'm saying add fortune a lot, I'm sorry, but it is what it is. So the JSX that this returns is basically pretty simple. It's basically a button and an input and a text input. So to be able to, I guess, enter the text in, what is this? To be able to enter the whatever new text we put in here, blah, if we wanted to make a new fortune, we have to attach it. There's a couple of steps involved. So the first thing would be to attach it to a state. And to do that, we can use the onChange event handler on the input. So onChange is similar to a button's onClick. It's basically yeah, it's very similar. So onClick, as you can tell, it happens when the button is clicked. OnChange, as you can probably also tell, is when the text in the input is changed. So same kind of thing, onChange, to give it a curly bracket, to give it a callback. And this is another instance of where we're going to be late. We're going to try and be lazy anyways. We're going to give it a callback with E. E stands for event. And this is standard for when you're making functions that handle events, such as an onChange event or an onClick event. Yeah, so in that, we're going to take, we're going to set new fortune to whatever is in this input. So to do that, we take the event and we take the target, so the element that the input is about, so to speak. So the target, so the e.event, the e.target for this one will be that input, and we'll take the value of that input. Oh, I just got rid of target. Yeah, so in short, the onChange callback tells the input to whenever your input is changed, set new fortune to whatever your value is. And so whenever we type in some new text, the state in React will change with it. So cool. We've now attached the state to the input. Now let's attach the button to the actual add fortune functionality. So button on click, that's for whenever we want a button to do anything on click. And because And usually I just put create fortune in here. However, there's a bit of a twist because in our API functions file, our create fortune should take in some text. So we'll give it fortune text for it to pass through. Let's create that. I'll get rid of this so it doesn't mess anything up. But let's create this API function first. So we can see down here we have an update fortune function already set up. It's a bit different to the other get requests that we've been sending in a way that we're sending data to the backend instead of just waiting for data to be sent back. So we need, along with the URL, we also need to give it the request options or request payload, as Hasith also worded it. So we can take this and I'll explain what is in the request options. The request options is basically an object that has, if you've done any kind of like networking subject or anything to do with HTTP, this will be pretty familiar to you. So the method would be a post method. So we're sending something rather than getting some information. And we'll have to send our fortune text in the body of our request. So in here, we've put it in a object with the name, with the key fortune name, so that when we send it to the backend API endpoint, it'll know that that's what this text is for, to make the fortune name of the fortune object. So another thing to note is that web requests, they don't take JSON objects. So we have to turn it into a string with JSON.stringify. So that's what that part's about. And the headers is another object to tell the backend that it's, to tell it how to deal with the body data. So we're telling it, hey, it's JSON, make sure to turn it into JSON when you're dealing with this data that I'm sending. Yeah, and so these two lines are pretty similar to the get request functions. So we have our URL, and as Hasith wrote back in the routes folder, routes file, the post is just a simple slash. And it knows to come to this route because it is the method is post. So that's where that comes in handy. Yes, up to here. So again, with the await, we're telling it to wait for this to come back and before we move on. So to use the fetch to post the data to the backend, in order to create our new fortune, we have to give it the URL as well as the request options. And then this data, console log data part, that's something to help us debug in case anything goes wrong. Because we aren't actually expecting any data back, that's where we can see what happens essentially, or if there's anything that does go wrong. Yeah, so our create fortune function is complete. Let's take that and go back to our add fortune. Oh, I forgot to save it. Take that and go back to our add fortune component. Is there any questions, by the way? I noticed it's been pretty quiet. And where's my Zoom? Oh my God, 42 messages. Okay. I trust Hasith to let me know if there's anything that I need to clarify.
I'll let you know. I'll let you know if there is.
Yeah, cool. Cool. Okay, cool. So yeah, so like I was saying before, you can't exactly just put create fortune in here. That's not how you spell fortune. You can't exactly put create fortune in here because in your API functions, it expects some text. So what we can do is separate that into a different function with the create fortune in there. And this is where we take the state that's been changing this entire time we're typing into that input box. And that's when it'll actually run that function from API functions file. So instead of create fortune, we'll give it the add fortune function to run later whenever that button's clicked. Okay, so we have our get working. It's getting the fortunes from the database. Let's go new fortune. And we'll go add fortune. And hey, look at that. It appears live, updating. We love that. Cool. Okay, so that's our create fortune. That's our create fortunes component done. Amazing. So let's go back to where we left off with the fortune card. Now for fortune card, we have update and delete left to do. So delete fortune. Let's do that one first because it's simpler. So the delete button. Whenever we want a button to do something, what do? We do on click. Yeah, rely on. Thanks autocorrect for giving me that capital letter. And for this one, we can do the callback function because I don't want to make a separate function just for deleting. So callback function, you use arrow function, rounded brackets for whatever parameters we're giving. Let's not give it anything for this one. And we want it to run delete fortune. And we'll give it some brackets because, okay, I won't save that for now. But just so you know, delete fortune is also coming from API functions. Let's go back in there and finish the rest of them. So delete is very similar to the other ones in the way that, okay, got him. Actually, it's similar in the way that we need a request options, but we don't need all this body stuff because in our routes, we've defined that the delete, for the delete route, the ID will be passed in through the URL parameters. So back to our API functions, we'll have a const request options. You might want to call it payload, but for sake of consistency in this one, we'll call it options. Give it an object. In this object, we just want to tell it that it's the method delete. And literally that's all we have to give it because all our data is being passed through our URL. So let's take that URL line, copy it here. So a base URL plus the ID that gets passed in when we run it in our fortune card component. ID. And also, you may be wondering the reason why I'm putting this underscore in is because if you ever look at the data in MongoDB, I don't have it open right now, but I remember what it looks like. Usually when it displays all your objects, it has a underscore ID as a naming convention for the automatically generated ID that MongoDB creates for it.
Rachel, just something.
Yes.
Some people have pointed out, thank you for
Yes.
pointing them out, but on line 34, the method should be put because it's update.
Yes. Yeah. That is true. Cool, thank you.
No worries.
All right, let's continue. With this parameters, we do want it to be ID, but we don't want it to be just plain old ID. We want it to be the actual value. So let's use what Hasith was talking about earlier with the backticks, template strings. So we want it to be slash and then the dollar curly braces to put the actual value of ID in there as a variable, not just the letters underscore ID. Cool. And yeah, same thing with this. We'll just take this line and chuck it in here. The dot then callback that we specify here is the same because we're not expecting any data to show back to us. This is just there to let us know if anything goes wrong. There is other, like that. Request options is not defined. Request options, that would be the problem. Okay, cool. What was I saying? Yes, okay, so error validation. So Hasith has kindly shown us how to do error validation on the back end, basically the try-catch part of what he was talking about. So you can also do a catch part here, but I decided to omit that in favor of time, which we've clearly violated given that it's 8:44. Yeah, so that's all our API functions done. We can go back to our React component and fill in the rest of it. We're almost done, I promise. Okay, so delete fortune, and we'll give it the ID that we extracted from our props. Yeah, so whenever that's clicked, it'll run this function, it'll run this task that we're telling it to do later. If we save that, should be able to refresh, and we can delete our new fortune. Unless something's happening. Control-Shift-I for inspect element. Response. Is it a bad thing? It's saying okay. Strange.
Wait, could you repeat the thing from beginning, Rachel? Sorry?
Sorry? Say it
Could you
again.
repeat the action from the beginning, like what you did just then?
To open up the console?
No, like,
Or the delete part?
yeah.
Okay, cool.
Sorry.
So, yeah, so on click, we're giving it a callback. So callback as opposed to, what I mean by callback is, I'll just put it in comments here, is the arrow function is the same as doing function something brackets 4 parameters and then whatever code in here. It's the same thing. It's just not declaring it separately like this edit function. And it's just telling the onClick, event handler to run this code whenever you've been clicked. And so the delete fortune function comes from the API connections, API functions file, which takes an ID. It doesn't matter what this is called. You can just have it as that, as long as wherever you're referring to it in here is the same. But I like it underscore, so I'm going to keep it underscore. And so yeah, this ID is coming from the props.fortune that we passed in when we rendered the list of fortunes. So we passed in the prop fortune equals the object fortune from there. And we've extracted it using this curly brackets funky syntax. That's pretty cool, I think. Does that make it any clearer?
Yep, it does.
Cool, that's good to know. I'll get rid of this comment. However, that's not working right now, so we've got to figure out what's wrong. So if I try to delete this, it says it's okay. Excuse me? Is it because I need to refresh? Surely not. Okay. Oh, there's then. Okay, there's something there. ID, we'll turn that into a class because classes don't have to be unique. And, oh, class name. Yes. Okay, cool. So if we refresh that, I should get rid of some of those. Each child on the list should have a unique key. Okay, I can fix that in a second. So what that each child in a list should have a unique key prop is talking about. That's just talking about here where we're mapping it to a bunch of fortune cards. Now, what's good to put is key prop, and what's a unique identifier that each of these fortune has. We can just use the fortune, oopsie, inside the curly brackets would be helpful. Fortune dot underscore ID. So that's our unique identifier, and that should take care of that one for us. If we refresh, and it doesn't have that red one anymore. Cool. So back to our deleting problem. That's giving us a response. Okay, this is another thing that useEffect you can do with useEffect. So the second parameter that useEffect takes, other than a callback function to do, is an array of things to depend on. So if anything in this array changes, then it'll also run that. That's to stop all this repeated nonsense from going on. But that's there to automatically update whenever it does change. So I'll just stop that for now. Refresh that. Okay, cool.
We have a message from Bao saying that in the param in the root, we did :id, but something. In the controller, we did param.fortune ID. So just undo that there, I guess, and just put that to be ID. Yeah.
That makes more sense.
Hmm?
Okay, let's go back to routes and change that. Thanks, Bao.
Yeah, and then you can get rid of the body reverse.
Sorry, what?
You can get rid of the adding it to the body of the
front
end.
Yes.
Yep.
I will. I'll start the back end first though.
Just undo. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's just delete in there, and we'll put this back in. Yeah. Save that, refresh, and give that a go. And it's still there. Anyways, I think in the interest of time, we'll skip that for now. And we'll go back to our edits to work on that part. And hopefully that will give us something to work with. Okay, so edit. We'll need to do two things. We'll need to attach the input to the new fortune state like we did with the add fortunes component. So we'll give the input a value, use curly brackets. So yeah, so value, we'll put the new fortune state in there. So whatever the new fortune state is, it'll be showing in the input. And then we'll need an on change callback. The one with the E for event. And we're grabbing the value. So in our callback, not a square bracket, curly bracket, we'll go e.target to indicate that it's this, this element that we're targeting, and we'll grab the value of it, of the text input. We don't just want to return that, we want to, oops, my bad, set the new fortune to whatever the value is. So we'll use that setter function that useState provides. And then on click for the button. Another callback. And this time it's a function that takes in something. So we'll give it, we might do the same for delete fortune if this works. New fortune, no, actually, fortune text to differentiate it from the state variable there. And we'll use update fortune. Oops. From the API functions there, and that takes a fortune text to send to the backend. Actually, no, wait, this one doesn't take anything. We're giving it directly from the state, directly from the new fortune state here. Yeah, that's what we're doing. And we haven't given it a callback, so that's why it's having a hissy fit right now. So we'll give it edit. Okay, so we've attached the value to the state, whatever the state is, it's showing, and whatever whatever is being typed will be saved to the state there. And then once we click edit, it should change it in the back end. So new fortune, we'll give it some key smash. Edit fortune, refresh it, and okay, so something's happening. Okay, I think I know. So async is an important part that we forgot probably, because we're not waiting for it to come back probably. We'll see. A lot of front-end development is a lot about iteration and testing to see if step by step if things work. So like I said before, debugging is an excellent skill to have. Let's try that again. Edit fortune. And it's still not changed. Okay. I think I know what's going on. Edit fortune. We need to tell it.
Edit fortune, we also provide an ID, remember?
Yeah, I was about to say that. We need to provide which fortune we're editing. So a fortune ID would be helpful. So we'll take a fortune ID, and that's in this function. We'll give it to the okay, let's give that a go. We'll give that some key smash. Edit and refresh.
Do you have any other UI things that you can do, or are you pretty much done?
I'm pretty much done. We can, I guess, change the way each card looks because it's a bit clunky right now. But those are minor things.
Give me a quick second. I'm just gonna do some stuff with Postman.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I guess in the meantime we can do that. Okay, so what we're gonna do is, if you remember back in our screenshot of the finished product, we have these nice clean looking fortune cards. Right now we've got these clunky inputs, and that is something we want to change based on if this edit button is clicked. So that's why we have this set is editing state up here. So let's give that a go. So to make something happen when a button is clicked, we use onClick. Give it the callback. We're giving it an arrow function that takes in nothing and does the set new, not set new fortune. Set is editing to whatever is editing is not currently. So not is editing, the opposite of whatever it is. And then down here, we're going to use a ternary operator in a different way. So we're going to use some JavaScript. We'll base it off is editing. If it's true, then we'll display all of this. If it's false, then we'll display nothing. It's as simple as that. And hopefully this works in our favor. All right, hey, look at that. We have these nice clean looking cards. We click away toggle. Okay, yeah, cool. And this show fortunes still doesn't toggle. Let me know when you have any suggestions that we can do to fix those update and delete things. Is it?
Yeah, sure thing.
What are we looking at? We're looking at see fortunes. This is where we make that hidden. Okay, so we change it that way. But let's see if we can do it the way that we just did with the edit fortunes input. So curly brackets is showing fortunes. If it's true, then we display all of this. Oops, tab that to make it neater. And then if it's false, then we display nothing. Okay. So it is showing fortunes. Is there? It's set to false. Get rid of this class name so it doesn't mess with our visibility or anything. Refresh. Aha, yay. We have toggling showing fortunes now. All right, butting in at the last minute with the promised update and delete functionality. So what happened after last week's event was that Hasith took a look at the code and found the problem. And it was that the request parameters, firstly, request parameters plural ID. So this part was right in the delete function. And let's fix the update function. So request parameters fortune ID should be ID. Now, this is because that while we were looking at different ways that the ID was sent through to the backend, we didn't consider how the backend interprets it when it gets the web request. So in our roots, we can take a look at how the backend interprets it here. So in our roots, we defined that whatever comes after the slash in a put web request is defined as ID. And same with any delete requests that come through with this kind of URL route. Everything after the slash is defined as ID. So that's how we need to treat it in our fortune controllers, because the parameters that are defined in here get passed through as the request.params object there. Okay, cool. So let's test that. I'll get rid of this console, the debugging console logs, so it's cleaner, and I will restart my server. Control-C to stop that. Yeah, so while we're waiting for the server to restart, it just goes to show that you don't have to worry about taking ages to find that misspelled variable name, or I don't know, a missing bracket, and that'll make you a bad developer. Like, we're only one pair of eyeballs after all. So thanks to Sith for finding that bug. If this will hurry up, we can show you how it works, hopefully. And I'll probably skip this part in the editing. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, cool. Now that that's done, we can go make sure it's saved. Yep. npm start to restart it. Successful. Okay, we can refresh that. And we have our fortunes, and we can delete a fortune. We refresh, and that fortune's gone. So yay, we successfully deleted that from the backend, from the database. We can add that back, of course. We will pet a cat soon. Add the fortune there. We got rid of our live updates from here. So remember how we talked about the use effect? We get rid of the list that it's of things that it's depending on to change. It'll find any sort of change and update the page. So let's put another one. Let's put new fortune. And we got another one live updated like that. Cool. And we can also, let's test editing. I want to new fortune instead of the exclamation marks. And it's edited like that. Okay, cool. Now you notice there's a couple of front-end features that we didn't get to cover that could make our page a lot more user-friendly. For example, when we add a new fortune, we want this text to go away because we don't want to just like add a bunch of the same ones. There's no point in that. So let's change that. Let's take a look at our C fortunes. Add fortune. All right, I think that's where we'll want to edit that text input. All right, so we have, every time we type in there, we have our onChange handler here. So every time it changes, every time the text input changes, the state will change. And I think add fortune is this one here. So it creates a fortune, cool, but let's add something else that clears the text input. So that's pretty simple. We can just use the useState Oh, and I just noticed we forgot to put an empty quote marks here just for safety. So yeah, so we've marked that state as a string. So let's set state, set new fortune, that state back to nothing. So when we click it, this function will be run and the function creates the fortune as well as sets the fortune to be nothing again. We'll save that. It'll refresh. Yeah, cool. Another one. Add fortune and A. We have a blank slate ready to go for the next fortune. Cool. And so with edit as well, let's do the same for that because once we click edit, it doesn't really clear this back to where it was. So let's go to our fortune card where the edit fortune text box text input is sitting. Yeah, cool. All right, is editing. Now, same as with the add fortune, we want to, after we do our communicating with the database, communicating with the backend function, let's do something to change the way the page looks. So let's put, firstly, is editing. We can set that to false so we can make it go away because we've finished our editing. We don't need to do any more unless the user wants to click that button and make it show again. So our user clicks the edit button, code goes to here, calls our update fortune function, and now it'll call our set is editing function and we'll change that to false because we no longer want to see that. Okay, cool. So we'll add some exclamation marks, edit fortune, and we are no longer editing. It's that text input's gone. Of course, we can open it again. We can toggle it like we've added at the end of the workshop. Cool. Yeah, I believe that's that. If we open this one, this is another one we can add. So you don't want to type in the whole fortune plus whatever edits you want to make. Let's just automatically have the fortune that it's talking about, fortune that this text block is talking about in there already. So what we can do is we can have, initially we can have the fortune from fortune name in here. Let's see what that does. We save that. Okay, we can refresh. Okay, we close that box, we close that box. Let's pick a different one. We open that box, it's initially there. Let's add some exclamation marks for excitement. And it turns out we cannot do that. All right, it's cool. So, yeah, so I assume that'll be because, well, you can't really edit that because it's not a state. Let's do, oh, I know. Let's just set the initial state of this to be fortune name that we grabbed from our props. So when we put, instead of putting the fortune name that we can't edit, let's put the new fortune state that we can edit. That should fix it. Go back to here, open this up, and we can edit it. Nice. So cool. If you spot any other front-end features that you think you can add, feel free to go ahead and experiment, of course. It's your fork. You can choose to do what you want, how you choose to mess with it, however you like. Of course, make sure you're editing your own database and not trying to mess up anyone else's.
As Rachel mentioned earlier, we do have quite a few events coming up. So that includes our community catch-ups, which is promoting women in STEM, mainly women in tech. Going up from that, we do have the return of the big project for its second year. I know Wendy and the events team has done some fantastic work on preparing that, and I can say that it's bigger than last year, with all honesty. So it is something to get excited for and get ready for, because signups will be starting soon and you can get started. And finally, we do have our final custom event with VMware, one of our other sponsors, on data center virtualization. So it is a professional certification talk with VMware. It's a great sort of insight into the certifications that VMware has to offer, especially the data center virtualization. So definitely please do come along for that. We'd love to see you at that. And thank you once again for coming along today. If you do have any questions, I know that my Discord is always open. Feel free to tag Rachel or myself in the TechSoc Discord, and we'll try and help you in any way possible. But thank you guys so much for coming along today. And yeah, we'll see you at other events.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed and got a lot out of it. Bye. All right, butting in at the last minute with the promised update and delete functionality. So what happened after the event the other week? Not the other week. Freaking hell. Okay, start over. All right, butting in with the last minute. Da, 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 da. All right, butting in at the last minute with the promised update and delete functionality. So what happened after last week's event was that Hasith took a look at the code and found the problem. And it was that the request parameters, firstly, request parameters plural ID. So this part was right in the delete function. And let's fix the update function. So request parameters fortune ID should be ID. Now, this is because that while we were looking at different ways that the ID was sent through to the backend, we didn't consider how the backend interprets it when it gets the web request. So in our roots, we can take a look at how the backend interprets it here. So in our roots, we defined that whatever comes after the slash in a put web request is defined as ID. And same with any delete requests that come through with this kind of URL route. Everything after the slash is defined as ID. So that's how we need to treat it in our fortune controllers, because the parameters that are defined in here get passed through as the request.params object there. Okay, cool. So let's test that. I'll get rid of this console, the debugging console logs, so it's cleaner, and I will restart my server. Control-C to stop that. Yeah, so while we're waiting for the server to restart, it just goes to show that you don't have to worry about taking ages to find that misspelled variable name, or I don't know, a missing bracket, and that'll make you a bad developer. Like, we're only one pair of eyeballs after all. So thanks to Sith for finding that bug. If this will hurry up, we can show you how it works, hopefully. And I'll probably skip this part in the editing. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, cool. Now that that's done, we can go make sure it's saved. Yep. npm start to restart it. Successful. Okay, we can refresh that. And we have our fortunes, and we can delete a fortune. We refresh, and that fortune's gone. So yay, we successfully deleted that from the backend, from the database. We can add that back, of course. We will pet a cat soon. Add the fortune there. We got rid of our live updates from here. So remember how we talked about the use effect? We get rid of the list that it's of things that it's depending on to change. It'll find any sort of change and update the page. So let's put another one. Let's put new fortune. And we got another one live updated like that. Cool. And we can also, let's test editing. I want to new fortune instead of the exclamation marks. And it's edited like that. Okay, cool. Now you notice there's a couple of front-end features that we didn't get to cover that could make our page a lot more user-friendly. For example, when we add a new fortune, we want this text to go away because we don't want to just like add a bunch of the same ones. There's no point in that. So let's change that. Let's take a look at our C fortunes. Add fortune. All right, I think that's where we'll want to edit that text input. All right, so we have, every time we type in there, we have our onChange handler here. So every time it changes, every time the text input changes, the state will change. And I think add fortune is this one here. So it creates a fortune, Cool, but let's add something else that clears the text input. So that's pretty simple. We can just use the use state. Oh, and I just noticed we forgot to put an empty quote marks here just for safety. So yeah, so we've marked that state as a string. So let's set state, set new fortune, that state back to nothing. So when we click it, this function will be run and the function creates the fortune as well as sets the fortune to be nothing again. We'll save that. It'll refresh. Yeah, cool. Another one. Add fortune and A. We have a blank slate ready to go for the next fortune. Cool. And so with edit as well, let's do the same for that, because once we click edit, it doesn't really clear this back to where it was. So let's go to our fortune card where the edit fortune text box, text input is sitting. Yeah, cool. All right, is editing. Now, same as with the add fortune, we want to, after we do our communicating with the database, communicating with the backend function, let's do something to change the way the page looks. So let's put, firstly, is editing. We can set that to false so we can make it go away, because we've finished our editing. We don't need to do any more unless the user wants to click that button and make it show again. So our user clicks the edit button, code goes to here, calls our update fortune function, and now it'll call our set is editing function, and we'll change that to false because we no longer want to see that. Okay, cool. So we'll add some exclamation marks, edit fortune, and we are no longer editing. It's that text input's gone. Of course, we can open it again. We can toggle it like we've added at the end of the workshop. Cool. Yeah, I believe that's that. If we open this one, this is another one we can add. So you don't want to type in the whole fortune plus whatever edits you want to make. Let's just automatically have the fortune that it's talking about, fortune that this text block is talking about in there already. So what we can do is we can have, initially we can have the fortune from fortune name in here. Let's see what that does. We save that. Okay, we can refresh. Okay, we close that box, we close that box. Let's pick a different one. We open that box, it's initially there. Let's add some exclamation marks for excitement. And it turns out we cannot do that. All right, it's cool. So, yeah, so I assume that'll be because, well, you can't really edit that because it's not a state. Let's do, oh, I know. Let's just set the initial state of this to be fortune name that we grabbed from our props. So when we put, instead of putting the fortune name that we can't edit, let's put the fortune, the new fortune state that we can edit. That should fix it. Go back to here, open this up, and we can edit it. Nice. So cool. If you spot any other front-end features that you think you can add, feel free to go ahead and experiment, of course. It's your fork. You can choose to do what you want, how you choose to mess with it, however you like. Of course, make sure you're editing your own database and not trying to mess up anyone else's.